frost bites. So does guilt. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Your notes make this journey special. Into the case. The moor lay still beneath its white mantle, each frost-laced blade of grass glinting like a shard of glass in the pale winter sun. A thin veil of mist hovered above the ground, swirling lazily whenever the faintest breeze disturbed it. To the villagers of Heatherford, the frost was merely another sign that Christmas was nearing, and that the annual winter fair, with its steaming mulled wine and brass band carols, was only hours away. No one imagined that the day's cheer would sour before the first song was played. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped snugly in a pale gray coat and sensible hat, had taken an early walk across the edge of the moor. She liked to observe the village in its quiet hours, before shopkeepers pulled up their shutters and children's laughter spilled into the streets. On this morning, the stillness was broken only by the faint crunch of her boots on frozen earth, until a sound reached her that made her stop short. It was not the wind, nor the distant chime of the church clock. It was sharp, sudden, and utterly wrong for such a morning. A man's cry, startled and cut short, echoing from somewhere near the frosted pool. The sound carried just far enough to prickle the hair at the nape of Miss Marple's neck, before it was swallowed by silence. She hurried forward, following a narrow track between skeletal hawthorns. The mist thickened near the pool, and when it parted, she saw a dark shape crumpled on the frozen grass. Arthur Pellington, retired banker, winter fair treasurer, and a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, lay on his back, his face pale against the frost. One hand was clenched tight, the other flung limply outward. His hat rested several feet away, rim brushed with ice. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her breath misting the air. There was no doubt he was gone. She noticed the faintest smear of mud at the hem of his immaculate overcoat, and the curious way his right shoe was damp, as though he had stepped briefly into water. Her eyes flicked to the clenched fist. A fragment of fabric protruded from between his fingers, dark, fine wool, the edge frayed. She did not touch it. By the time she had risen, the mist was curling away, and the village was beginning to stir. Soon there would be voices, running feet, the sharp ring of alarm spreading from doorstep to doorstep. Miss Marple knew this was not an accident. Death had come to the frosted moor, and it would not leave without stirring every hidden shadow in Heatherford. She looked once more at Arthur Pellington, then turned towards the village, walking with the unhurried air of a woman going to fetch the constable. All the while, her mind was sifting the small, telling details, the kind that other people would see, without ever truly noticing. Would you like me to continue with the next section where gossip begins to ripple through Heatherford as the news spreads? Word travels fastest in places where there is little else to do. And in Heatherford there was nothing the frost could slow so effectively as it slowed the spread of alarm. By the time Miss Marple reached the constable's cottage on Mill Row, the tidings had run ahead of her on swift and invisible feet. Mrs. Finch, who took in ironing and considered herself the lungs of the village, had opened her door to shake crumbs from a cloth and saw Miss Marple's composed approach. Within minutes, she was telling the grocer that Miss Marple had that look about the eyes, which meant something dreadful. The grocer, remembering who had passed his window earlier that morning, recalled Arthur Pellington buying barley sweets and a packet of envelopes. And the barley sweets, by the time the story reached the butcher's, had become a bottle of brandy and a quarrel about accounts. So the village readied itself for shock, even before shock arrived on an official boot. Constable Webb, who had not long been married and whose wife was convinced he would catch his death in this climate, came out buttoning his greatcoat. face flushed from haste and hot tea. He touched his helmet in an automatic salute to Miss Marple, then faltered at the sight of her expression. "Mrs. Marple," he said, using the honorific the village lent her, whether it fit or not. "You've the look of a bearer of news." "I hope only of necessary facts, my dear Webb," she replied. "Mr. Pellington is lying by the frosted pool. I am afraid he's quite past your help." Webb's jaw tightened. "You're sure?" "Quite," she said gently. "And while we go, it may be prudent to ask that no one trespass there until you've had your look." I did not disturb him. There are one or two small matters best seen as they are. He took that in with an anxious nod and set off at her side. They crossed the green where bunting lay in coils on trestle tables, the winter fair not yet unfurled into life. A knot of early helpers stood irresolute beside the bandstand. Mrs. Henrietta Blount, who organized everything from choirs to charity raffles with inexhaustible assurance, saw the constable and made a beeline. "Webb, is it true what Mrs. Finch's cousin has heard from the milkman? That there's been some dreadful accident?" she demanded, pale beneath her rouge. "Arthur hasn't arrived with the takings float. We've a till sitting as empty as the vicar's collection plate in Lent." "Back to your tables, Mrs. Blount," Webb said, trying for firmness. "We'll have the truth soon enough." But truth, when it arrived, brought the fair to a stunned halt. Webb, seeing the figure on the white grass, let out a breath that was almost a groan. He crouched, careful, as Miss Marple had been careful. His hand hovered above the little fist, and then thought better of it. "We'll want Inspector Cray from much reading," he muttered. "And the doctor, and, oh Lord, Mr. Pellington's sister." "Mrs. Vera Pellington will be at the house in Fox Lane, sorting his scarf drawer," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "She always does on Mondays. People are creatures of habits, Constable. That is what makes crime so inconvenient." They interrupt. Webb looked up at her. "You saw something?" "I saw a man who dressed for display but not for the Moor," she said. "Mr. Pellington always had neatness to the edge of fussiness. Yet his right shoe is damp and there's a smear of mud on the hem of his coat. Last night the ground froze hard. Where, I wonder, would a gentleman pick up mud this morning?" She let her gaze drift to the low slope beyond the pool where a drainage runnel, fed by an underground spring, never quite iced over. "Also, he has grasped a fragment of fine dark wool. There are many dark coats in Heatherford, few of so fine a weave. You've a sharp eye, ma'am." "An old one, which is a different thing," she said. "Age teaches you to notice the little nothings no one else chooses to see." Webb straightened and placed himself like a guard between the body and the path. He sent a village boy running for Dr. Lionel Hargreaves and another to ring much reading for Inspector Cray. Miss Marple waited in that tactful stillness she used in sick rooms and nursery crises, as if her very calm could borrow time. The doctor arrived with a briskness that suggested he preferred definite complaints to this sort of ambiguity. He knelt, checked the eyes and the slack jaw, and said not loudly, "He's been dead scarcely an hour. No obvious wound. There, hold a moment. Small abrasion beneath the left ear, bruise at the throat. Could be a fall. Could be, well." He looked at Webb. "Leave that for Cray. Don't allow anyone to manhandle him." "Would shock have done it, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Sometimes men of Mr. Pellington's sort have hearts that resent surprises." "Possible," the doctor said. "More likely a struggle. But we'll not guess." They stood in silence a moment, looking at the mist thinning to tatters over the pool. A magpie hopped near the hat and scolded, then flew. The air held its breath. "Arthur Pellington," Dr. Hargreaves said at last, as if reciting an entry he did not wish to read. "Treasurer of the fair, keeper of figures, dined every Thursday with the Blounts, cards with Mr. Cyril Dove at the King's Bell on Saturdays, quarreled, quietly, with Tom Yates over the allotment hedge last week, if my housemaid overheard truly. Made himself useful and not loved, that one. Useful people are sometimes resented like vigorous medicines," Miss Marple murmured. The first spectators crept to the edge of the cordon. Webb created out of nothing more than his presence and a raised palm. Mrs. Blount returned, bringing with her Vera Pellington, who had the dry, composed grief of a woman who has spent half her life controlling her household's expression of feeling. She saw her brother on the ground and made a small sound, like a hinge giving way. "Not here," Miss Marple whispered, stepping into the space between Vera and the sight. "Let the inspector come. Come away, my dear. You will want a chair." Vera allowed herself to be turned, her gloved hand tightening on Miss Marple's sleeve. "He went out before breakfast," she said in a clipped voice that fought with itself. "Said he had something to see to at the pond. The pool, he always called it, as though he were a gentleman at his fishery. He took that ridiculous cane of his and his second-best coat. I told him the fair needed him early, but Arthur would not be hurried." "Second-best coat," Miss Marple said. "Not the black with the velvet collar?" "No," Vera said. "The dark blue." Mr. Blount had admired the black. Arthur thought it too showy for the morning. "Why are you asking me this? What does it matter what coat?" "Clothes often matter to men who think themselves above being read," Miss Marple said, patting the gloved hand. "And to those who read them. Come, Mrs. Pellington. Sit a little." Inspector Cray arrived in a motor from much reading with Sergeant Dow and an air of having been dragged from the warmth of his office and into a problem that would require more patience than he preferred. He took in the scene, fixed on the figure of Miss Marple with a look that mixed respect and wary amusement. He had crossed paths with St. Mary Mead's quiet legend once before, and set about briskly. "Right," he said to Webb. "You've done sensibly. No touching, no trampling. Doctor—" He accepted the outlines of Hargreaves's observations. "Good. Keep him until I have the scene photographed. Mrs. Marple," he inclined his head, "if you saw the body first, I'll want your precise account in due course." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said, a model of agreeable modesty. She always found that men who liked to manage were easier to manage when you obliged them with the appearance of being managed. Cray's questions began where they usually did. Who last saw the deceased? Who might benefit? Who had quarreled with him? They radiated outwards through the knot of villagers. Mrs. Blount's answers came in flourishes. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lyle, spoke gently of Arthur's faithfulness to pew and pledge. Cyril Dove from the King's Bell stood stolidly with an air of someone calculating whether grief or indignation was expected of him, and opting for neither just yet. Tom Yates, the young carpenter, hovered at the edge with the defensive carriage of a man who knows his freckles count against him when tempers run high. It emerged that the winter fair's takings float, notes and coin sufficient to make the stalls jingle and the charity tin respectable, had been due from Arthur that morning. It had not arrived. It further emerged when Mrs. Blount, stoked by indignation and fear in equal measures, confessed that she had entrusted Arthur with a sealed envelope containing 3 of the grand prize raffle tickets to be delivered to the vicarage, that the envelope, too, was missing. "And I wrote the number of each on a slip in my bureau," she added. "Though, of course, that's not to say." Oh, Inspector, what a day. Money missing, then, Cray said neutrally. And Mr. Pellington had enemies. Enemies is a word for novels, Mrs. Lyle said, reproachful. There are annoyances, disappointments. Oh, Inspector, I suppose we are all tempted to use uglier words when we are frightened. Tom Yates, at last pushed forward by a whisper from someone behind him, faced the inspector. I don't know about enemies. He had his ways of making a fellow feel small. Last week he told me the stall I built for the bake sale was adequate for a barn, perhaps, and that I should learn to keep my accounts the way gentlemen do, by which he meant the way Arthur did. But I didn't. Well, I never wished him. His throat worked. I was in my shed from 5. Ask Mr. Hollis. He came by for that chair leg. Cyril Dove spoke with unexpected sharpness. If there's money gone, look to where money goes. Arthur played cards more than was wise, not with me. He added quickly at Miss Marple's faint upward glance. I've children. But there's a gentleman's game at the reading room Thursdays after choir practice, and they don't sing when they sit. Cray's mouth compressed. We'll look to all we must. Miss Marple said nothing through these exchanges. She watched. She had always said that it was astonishing how much people told you by the things they were careful not to say. Mrs. Blount did not once ask whether Arthur had suffered. She asked where the money was and how the fair would proceed. Vera Pellington, when she regained her composure, asked if she might send for the housemaid to bring Arthur's scarf, because he would not like to be without it, even now. And when Cray gently said that was not necessary, a faint flush stained her cheeks. Not of shame, Miss Marple thought, but of annoyance at being thwarted. Tom Yates's eyes flicked not to the body, but to the pool, and then away again with a haste that spoke of guilt about something that might not be a crime, but was certainly a secret. And Cyril Dove, bluff and practical, had introduced cards into a conversation that had not yet asked for them. Cray, granting Miss Marple a nod that was almost collegial, oversaw the removal of the body and directed Webb to make a list of those who had been near the moor before 8 o'clock. The fair was postponed. Bunting draped, limp and defeated. A thin, miserable snow began to fall. Flakes too fine to cover, too persistent to ignore. People drifted away in 2s and 3s, carrying their versions of events like hot coals cupped in their hands. Miss Marple went home for a late cup of tea, not because she required it, but because it gave people an excuse to speak. In the high street, she met Lydia Gray, the seamstress whose mending basket overflowed at this season with mittens and cuffs, and who always had a quiet corner of knowledge she appeared not to value. You'll have heard, Miss Marple said, as if the news were a weather report. Lydia nodded, face pale. And then, after a hesitation, I've a silly thing to ask, Miss Marple. Would a scrap of blue worsted be of any use? She fumbled at her pocket and produced a small tangle of fine wool, almost the exact shade Vera had called dark blue, with an edge that showed where a stitch had been snagged. I found this by the stile near the runnel as I came from the Blounts last night, caught in the old iron. I put it in my pocket, thinking Mrs. Blount would scold me for leaving the stile unmended if she knew I'd seen it. Miss Marple took the wool, turned it between forefinger and thumb, and felt the faintest lift of the hairs on her wrists. It may be nothing, she said, but nothing is a little trap word, Miss Gray. One should always ask what kind. I didn't want to tell the inspector, Lydia whispered. He frightens me like schoolmasters do. Then consider me a schoolmistress with a fondness for good behavior, Miss Marple said, and smiled. Thank you. It was thoughtful to keep it safe. She walked on, the wool tucked into her glove, and allowed her mind to arrange the morning's tableau as a housewife arranges plates. Here the missing money, there the scrap of fine wool in a dead man's hand. Here the damp shoe and the smear of mud, there the runnel that never froze. And between them, a path of frost someone had trodden twice, once to come, once to go. She remembered a small incident from many years ago involving a cat, a ball of worsted, and a gentleman too vain to admit he was losing his hair. Human nature, she had always found, did not change as much as it fancied. When Inspector Cray called in the afternoon to take her statement, he found her by the fire with her knitting, a calm presence in a day that had given him very little of that commodity. She told him, precise and unembroidered, what she had seen and not touched. She showed him the scrap Lydia had given her and told him where it had been caught. He made a note, looked at her from under his brows, and said, "You've a feel for these things, Mrs. Marple. What do you make of it?" "That someone was expected at the pool," she said gently. "Expected or summoned. Mr. Pellington dressed with care even when he meant to be comfortable, which is a contradiction, but a common one. He took his second-best coat. He meant to be respectable without making a show. He stepped where his shoe would be wetted because he went near the runnel. He brushed against something, iron perhaps, and caught a thread. He met a person who wears fine wool. Many do. But fine wool, that phrase so? That is less common." Cray grunted. "And the money?" "Money is like a cloak, Inspector. It warms the innocent and hides the guilty. It may have been taken because it was convenient. But the motive may be older and bitterer than coins. Mr. Pellington enjoyed power measured in small humiliations. Those accumulate, like icicles on an eave. It takes only a sharp tap to bring them down." Cray closed his notebook. "We found his cane near the stile," he said, almost casually. "A smear of paint on the ferrule. Blue, fresh. Webb is at the Pellington house now, asking after coats." "How very efficient of Constable Webb," Miss Marple said. "Blue paint is a vulgar thing for a gentleman's cane to collect. But then, vulgarity is often the fingerprint of haste." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat a while longer with her needles idle in her lap. Through the frosted window she could see the lane, where Tom Yates passed with his shoulders hunched and his hands jammed in his pockets, and behind him, at a distance that wanted to be accident and failed, Vera Pellington moving with the peculiar dignity of a woman who has not yet decided whether grief will be permitted to rearrange her day. Miss Marple thought of Lydia's scrap and of the velvet-collared black coat hanging untouched in a wardrobe. She thought of a cane with blue paint and of a style that caught more than hems. Outside, the snow ticked at the panes like a polite visitor. Somewhere in the village, a telephone rang, was answered, and rang again. The fair would not be held today, but people still had cakes to frost, jam to boil, raffles to speculate about. Life made its noises, even when death had made its claim. And somewhere, perhaps in a parlor where curtains were only half drawn, perhaps in a workshop that smelled of shavings and glue, someone was thinking not of shock or sorrow, but of what must be done next. Because those who commit themselves to an act of violence very often discover they have committed themselves to a series. Miss Marple rose and put on her coat. She would pay a call on Vera, as any considerate neighbor might. She would ask to see the coats. Women were always happy to show their stores to other women if one did it in the right tone. And perhaps, in the corner of a cuff or the inner seam of a pocket, she would find something as insignificant as the frayed edge of a problem that did not wish to be solved. The frost was beginning to soften when Miss Marple set out along Fox Lane, the snow having thinned to a lacework that clung only to the edges of hedgerows. Her breath puffed in gentle clouds as she walked, the air keen with the scent of wood smoke from breakfast fires. She carried no handbag, nothing to make the visit seem formal. Only a small, covered basket containing a jar of quince jelly, a contribution presented under the guise of neighborly sympathy. Vera Pellington, for all her guarded nature, would hardly refuse to admit someone who came with food. Fox Lane curved away from the main street and dwindled to a narrow road flanked by mossy stone walls. The Pellington house stood halfway along, a solid Georgian affair whose front door gleamed with a polish suggesting pride rather than warmth. Its windows were dressed in neat curtains of pale damask, drawn back evenly on either side, not a thread out of place. Miss Marple paused at the gate to note the small patches of trampled frost on the gravel drive. Some of them clearly Webb's boot prints from earlier that morning, others lighter and shorter, belonging to Vera herself or her maid. But there was also a third set, deep and broad, as if the wearer were a man of heavier build. They led to the side door rather than the main entrance. Vera answered the front door herself, a surprising concession. She was still in her morning dress, a navy wool gown with a high collar, and her hair was drawn back so severely that it seemed to pull her features into sharper lines. If she had been weeping, the evidence had been carefully removed. "Miss Marple," she said in a tone balanced between surprise and weary civility. "What a morning. Do come in, though I fear the house is in disarray." Miss Marple followed her into a narrow hall whose runner carpet was immaculate. She handed over the basket with a small smile. "Just a little jelly. It keeps well, and I thought you might have callers who need a spoonful with tea." "How thoughtful. I'm afraid I've had more callers than I care for already," Vera said, placing the basket on a polished side table. The constable returned to ask about Arthur's things, his cane, his coats, his boots. I told him everything I could, but I don't know how it helps. Do you suppose they'll find someone? Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "They will find someone, my dear. Whether or not it is the right someone, that is why one must be careful." Vera gave a short, almost brittle laugh and gestured towards the parlor. "Come through. I've lit the fire." It seemed wrong to sit in the cold. The parlor was a room of deliberate order. Porcelain figurines on the mantel in symmetrical pairs, framed photographs arranged by size on the piano. A tea tray set with cups whose handles all faced the same way. Miss Marple took a seat close to the fire, her eyes noting not only the neatness, but the absence of anything personal belonging to Arthur. No hat on the stand, no gloves on the sideboard. "You must be feeling quite adrift," she said softly. Vera settled opposite her, smoothing her skirt. Arthur could be difficult, but he was part of the furniture, you know. You expect certain things to remain. "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "he went out this morning without his best coat. The black with the velvet collar. I think you told me." "That's right. He wore the navy. The black is in his wardrobe." "Why?" "Oh, I was merely thinking of the weather. Velvet is hardly practical on a frosty morning, though the navy is better suited to such an outing. Still, it is very fine wool for country wear, is it not?" Vera's eyes narrowed faintly. It was an expensive coat. Arthur liked to be well dressed. He said it set an example. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. "Do you suppose I might look at it? I am helping with the jumble sale next month, and I'm forever being asked what constitutes good wear. Seeing a truly well-made coat would be most instructive." The request was couched in such homely terms that Vera could hardly refuse. After a moment's hesitation, she rose. If you like. Come along then. They ascended the stairs to a front bedroom where the curtains were half drawn against the watery winter sun. The wardrobe stood in a corner, its doors opening with a faint sigh of cedar-scented air. Inside hung a row of garments, suits, coats, and a spare dressing gown, all arranged with military precision. Vera reached for the black coat, the velvet collar catching the light in a deep, soft gleam. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes flicking over the fabric. The wool was indeed of fine quality, but on the lower right sleeve, near the inner seam, there was a faint fraying, as though the cloth had been caught on something and pulled. The threads were short, almost invisible unless one looked closely. "Beautifully made," she said, brushing her fingers lightly near the fray, but not touching it. "And such a good color, though I dare say it would show a snag more easily than the navy." "It has been mended before," Vera said quickly. "Arthur once caught it on the latch of the garden gate. I was furious, but our Lydia, the seamstress, repaired it almost invisibly." Miss Marple's brows lifted in mild interest. "Ah, yes, Lydia Gray. Such neat work she does. I wonder if she was the last to have it in hand." "Possibly," Vera said, then closed the wardrobe with a firmness that suggested the visit was at an end. "In any case, the coat was here this morning. Arthur never wore it today." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "It is important to be certain of such details." Back in the parlor, Vera poured tea, her movements precise, but her gaze unfocused. "Do you think," she said abruptly, "that it could have been robbery? Arthur sometimes carried money for the fair. Perhaps someone followed him." "That is one possibility," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea without drinking. "But robberies, in my experience, are rarely so pointed. To rob a man in a public place is one thing. To kill him in a place where the killer might easily be seen, that is something else entirely." Vera's hand trembled slightly as she set down the Furchtzo teapot. "Arthur could be very sharp with people. He thought it kept them in their place, but that doesn't mean they'd—" She trailed off, as though unwilling to speak the word. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze resting kindly on Vera. "Human nature is a curious thing, my dear. Resentments can simmer for years without a ripple on the surface, until something, some small slight or sudden opportunity, tips the balance." A knock at the front door interrupted them. Vera rose, clearly relieved, and returned a moment later with Constable Webb. His cheeks were red from the cold, and he looked faintly apologetic. "Beg pardon, Mrs. Pellington, but Inspector Cray sent me to fetch that navy coat your brother wore this morning. For the record, you understand." Vera hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to Miss Marple before she said, "It's hanging in the hall cupboard. Take it if you must." Webb returned in under a minute with the coat folded over his arm. As he passed Miss Marple, she noted a faint darkening at one cuff. Not dirt exactly, but a damp mark that had dried stiffly. Webb did not notice her glance. He was too intent on keeping the coat away from the floor. When he had gone, Vera sank back into her chair. "I suppose I should be grateful they're being thorough. It's just unsettling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But thoroughness is the best chance one has of discovering the truth." She rose then, drawing on her gloves. "You will have a great deal to manage in the next few days, Mrs. Pellington. If you should find any of Arthur's things out of place, do let the inspector know. Even the smallest matter may be important." Vera inclined her head. "I will." Outside, the air was sharpening again as the afternoon waned. Miss Marple took the long way back, circling past the churchyard and the line of cottages that backed onto the moor. She paused by the stile near the runnel, leaning lightly on it as though resting. The iron catch was rusty and jagged, perfectly capable of pulling a thread from fine wool. She imagined Arthur crossing here, perhaps meeting someone on the other side. Someone whose temper or purpose had been building for some time. At the King's Bell, the low murmur of voices drifted out each time the door opened. She saw Cyril Dove at the bar, speaking earnestly to a man with his back to the street. When Cyril glanced up and saw her, his expression flickered. Surprise, then something almost like calculation. He raised his glass in a polite half-salute. Miss Marple nodded in return and continued homeward, her mind layering the day's observations. The fray on the black coat, the damp mark on the navy, the heavy male footprints at Vera's side door, Lydia's scrap of wool, and the curious nervousness in Cyril's eyes. All separate pieces, perhaps, or all part of the same quiet pattern. She knew better than to rush at such puzzles. Patterns, after all, showed themselves most clearly when one stood back and let them settle into place. And somewhere within Heatherford, someone was beginning to wonder just how much Miss Marple might already suspect, and whether the frost on the moor had preserved more than just a body. Would you like me to carry the story into Section 4 with the village gossip, tightening into the naming of the first real suspect? By the next morning, Heatherford had wrapped itself in a kind of brittle quiet that felt more like preparation than peace. Frost had crept back in the night, whitening the roofs and laying a thin crust on puddles. It also seemed to have coated the villagers' tongues, not in silence, but in that particular guarded way people speak when they know the subject is dangerous, but cannot resist it. Miss Marple observed this as she walked to the grocer's. Pairs of women bent their heads close over baskets. Men loitered a moment too long at the post office counter. Snatches of conversation floated past, like the flicker of birds in hedgerows. Well, I heard it from Tom Yates's aunt. Found near the runnel, so they say. Inspector Cray's keeping an eye on the bell. Vera's not herself, poor soul, but then, inside the grocer's, Mrs. Finch was in full confidence with Mrs. Blount. The moment Miss Marple stepped over the threshold, the talk paused, then shifted into a more respectable gear. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch said, arranging apples as if their positions were a matter of great urgency. "Cold enough to freeze your marrow, it is." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, selecting a modest bag of tea and some oatmeal. "I see the fair's bunting has been taken down." Mrs. Blount gave a sniff. "One can't have a fair with a murder underfoot. Not that I don't sympathize with Vera, but it does leave the charities short, and it was to be our best year yet, too." She looked meaningfully at Mrs. Finch. "I suppose you've heard Inspector Cray has taken a particular interest in Tom Yates." Mrs. Finch's eyes widened with pleasure at being given the cue. "Oh, yes. Webb went round last night, so I'm told, asking questions about his comings and goings. Seems Tom was seen heading toward the moor at first light yesterday." "By whom?" Miss Marple asked mildly, tucking her purchases into her basket. Mrs. Finch hesitated just long enough to suggest she was choosing the version of events that made the best story. "By young Eddie Partridge, delivering milk. Said he saw Tom with his hands in his pockets, head down like a man with business he didn't care to share." "Of course," Miss Marple said, as if this were an entirely ordinary piece of information. She paid for her things and made her way to the door, but not before catching the flicker of triumph in Mrs. Blount's eyes. The look of someone who had found a narrative that suited her sense of order. On the green, Constable Webb stood speaking, with Inspector Cray, who was stamping his feet against the cold. Both turned as Miss Marple approached. "Morning, Mrs. Marple," Cray said. "Seems the whole village is talking about your Mr. Yates, not my Mr. Yates, Inspector," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Merely a young man I have known since he was in short trousers. Has something new come to light?" "Perhaps," Cray said. "We've had word he and Pellington had words over that allotment hedge. Yates wanted to shift the boundary by a foot or two. Pellington refused. Could be nothing. But there's also this." He nodded to Webb, who produced a small paper packet. Inside was a brass button, slightly tarnished, with a smear of dried mud on its rim. "Found it near the runnel on the Moor path," Webb said. "Could be from anyone's coat. But it's the sort often used on workmen's jackets, and Yates wears one near every day." Miss Marple regarded the button thoughtfully. "And does the button know to whom it belongs, Constable? Or only we who like to think we can read such things?" Cray gave a short laugh. "You've a point. Still, it's worth asking him. I've had Webb send word that I'll want to see him at the reading room this afternoon." The reading room was used for everything from parish meetings to the gentlemen's Thursday card game. But that afternoon, it became Cray's impromptu interview room. Miss Marple, under the guise of delivering some knitted socks for the vicar's Christmas charity box, found herself conveniently nearby when Tom Yates arrived. He came in with the air of a man determined to keep his back straight. The freckles across his nose stood out sharply against his pale skin, and his hands, large, capable carpenter's hands, twisted his cap in a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. "Sit down, Yates," Cray said. "We've a few questions about yesterday morning." Tom's gaze darted to Miss Marple, lingering only a fraction of a second before returning to the inspector. "I've told Webb already. I was in my shed, fixing a chair leg for Mr. Hollis." "And yet," Cray said, "you were seen walking towards the moor about 7 o'clock. Tom frowned. "I cut across the edge of it to get to Hollis's. It's quicker than going round by the road. Didn't think it mattered." "Did you see Mr. Pellington?" "No." The answer came quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Didn't see a soul till Hollis's yard." Cray placed the brass button on the table between them. "Recognize this?" Tom's eyes flickered to it, then away. "Looks like one off my jacket. But I've all of them still on, so it can't be." Miss Marple, who had been examining a knitting pattern with great absorption, said without looking up, "Buttons can be replaced, you know. A missing one doesn't always leave a gap if it's sewn in time. And sometimes people don't notice a loss until much later." Tom's shoulders stiffened. "I've not lost a button." "Even so," Cray said, "you had a quarrel with Pellington." "I had words," Tom corrected, his voice tightening. "He liked to talk down to folk. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're getting at." Cray studied him for a long moment before nodding to Webb. "We'll check your alibi. You can go for now." Tom rose, but not before giving Miss Marple a look that was half appeal, half defiance. She returned it with one of mild sympathy. When he had gone, Cray turned to her. "Well, you've known him longer than I have. Think he's our man?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that young men with tempers are often accused of far worse than they've done, and that people are very ready to fit the facts to the person they dislike most. It is more comfortable that way." Cray made a non-committal sound, but Miss Marple could see he was weighing her words. That evening, the King's Bell was fuller than usual, the murder having driven the villagers indoors to warmth and speculation. Miss Marple took her customary seat near the fire, knitting in hand. It was here she heard the next interesting thing. Not from the main bar, but from the alcove behind it, where Cyril Dove's voice carried low and urgent. "Told you, we can't have the inspector sniffing around the Thursday game. Not now." A murmur of response, then Cyril again. "Arthur was a fool to bring that money anywhere near the table. I told him as much. Now look where we are." Miss Marple kept her head bent over her work, but her ears sharpened. It was not proof of anything, of course, but it placed Cyril in a web she had already suspected was there. One made of money, pride, and the quiet pressure of debts best kept out of daylight. As she made her way home, she thought of Tom Yates and his boundary dispute, of the brass button near the runnel, and of Cyril's low-voiced annoyance. There was a chance both men were involved in the tangle, or that one was being used to shield the other. In Heatherford, as in all small places, the truth was rarely as simple as one guilty party. The frost was forming again, silvering the cobbles under her feet. Somewhere behind her, a door shut softly, and she caught the faintest sense of being followed. When she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing to see but the empty street and the still, cold air. She walked on, the click of her boots steady, her mind already sorting through the day's impressions. The naming of a suspect, she knew, was often the moment when the real culprit grew bolder, or more desperate. And in either case, that was when the most revealing mistakes were made. Would you like me to take Section 5 into the next morning, when a fresh twist shifts suspicion away from Tom and onto someone entirely unexpected? The next morning broke under a sky the color of pewter, the light thin and grudging. The frost had settled deep in the night, covering the moor in a glaze that crackled underfoot. Miss Marple, rising early, noted the sharp clarity of the air, the kind that carried sound unusually well. She could hear the clink of a milk pail from a farm half a mile away, the crisp bark of a dog, and, faintly, the irregular tolling of the church bell. It was not the hour for a service. The bell's uneven rhythm told her it was being rung by someone unaccustomed to the rope, and for a reason other than worship. She took her coat and scarf without hesitation. At the churchyard gate, she found a small group gathered, their breath smoking in the cold. Lydia Gray stood among them, pale and flustered, her gloved hands twisting together. At her feet, resting awkwardly on the frozen grass, was a wooden cash box. The lid was closed, but its paint was scratched and the keyhole showed signs of having been forced. Inspector Cray was there already, his cap pulled low and his overcoat collar turned up against the wind. He looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Well, Mrs. Marple, it seems the dead man's missing float has come back to us," he said grimly. "Lydia here found it behind the font this morning when she came to arrange the flowers." "Empty?" Miss Marple asked. Cray nodded. "Not a farthing left. But it's the same box Mrs. Blount described. And see here." He flipped the lid to reveal the faint imprint of a velvet collar against the dust inside, as if the box had been carried pressed against a man's coat. "What do you make of that?" Miss Marple bent to examine the inside. The dust pattern was indeed curious, not merely a smudge, but a textured mark consistent with fine pile. She straightened, her eyes thoughtful. And this was behind the font. "That's what Lydia says." Cray gestured for the young woman to explain. "I come in early, most Thursdays," Lydia said in a rush. "I like to get the flowers done before anyone else arrives. I was setting the jug on the sill when I noticed the edge of the box peeping out from behind the font curtain. I thought it was odd, so I pulled it out. I nearly dropped it when I saw what it was." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And you touched nothing else?" "No, ma'am. Went straight to fetch the vicar, and he sent for the inspector." Cray added, "The vicar says the church was unlocked until 9 last night for choir practice. Could be anyone slipped in then and hid the box." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia. "Did you notice the curtain hem? It looked to me as though a few threads had caught on something recently." Lydia blinked. "I suppose it did. The cloth there is old. Snags easily." As they spoke, Mrs. Blount bustled up, her cheeks pink from the cold and from the excitement of being near the scene of discovery. "So they found it. I told you it would turn up. Mark my words, Tom Yates will be the one who put it there. Probably thought the church a safe hiding place." Cray gave her a cool glance. "We've no proof of that, Mrs. Blount. And it seems to me the velvet mark inside the box points to someone else entirely." Mrs. Blount frowned. "What do you mean?" But Miss Marple, her eyes still on the box, was already thinking of the black coat in the Pellington wardrobe, the one with the velvet collar and the faint fraying near the seam. It would certainly leave such an impression if pressed against wood. She left the churchyard soon after, her mind busy. If the box had been carried by someone wearing that coat, then the coat had been out of the wardrobe after all, despite Vera's insistence. And if Vera had lied, was it to protect herself? Or another? Later that morning, she called at the vicarage on a small errand of delivering knitted scarves for the parish drive. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lyle, met her at the door, bustling her into the warmth of the sitting room. "Such excitement over that wretched box," Mrs. Lyle said, pouring tea. "The vicar has been up to his ears with questions. Honestly, one might think the church a den of thieves." "Sometimes thieves choose the quietest places," Miss Marple said mildly. "It keeps them from being disturbed." Mrs. Lyle hesitated, then leaned closer. "You didn't hear it from me, but Vera Pellington was seen leaving the church just before choir practice ended last night. Mrs. Crispin told me. She was on her way past with her knitting basket. She saw Vera slip out the side door in quite a hurry." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "How interesting. I wonder what took her there at such an hour." Mrs. Lyle shrugged. "Funeral arrangements, perhaps. Though why she wouldn't speak to the vicar, I can't imagine. And she wasn't carrying anything in with her. But she might have carried something out." When Miss Marple left the vicarage, she went by way of Fox Lane again. Vera's house stood as primly as before, but this time the side door stood ajar. A moment later, Vera herself appeared, her face tightening at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple, is something the matter?" "I thought I might pay a brief call," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I hear the missing box has been found." Vera's eyes flickered. "Yes, in the church of all places. Shocking. And yet, perhaps a very good hiding place," Miss Marple said. "Especially for someone who might wish to distance themselves from the scene on the moor." Vera's lips thinned. "If you're suggesting—" "My dear, I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "But I do think you should tell Inspector Cray whether you wore Arthur's black coat recently. Velvet leaves such distinctive marks. I'm sure you wouldn't wish to be misunderstood." Vera's face went pale, and for a moment she looked as if she might speak. But she merely said, "I've nothing to add to what I've told him already," and turned back into the house. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll towards the carpentry shed where Tom Yates worked. She found him planing a length of oak, the rhythmic scrape of his tool steady but tense. "Tom?" she said gently. Have you been told about the cash box? He nodded. Webb came round. Said it was found in the church. Told me that cleared me, but I'm not so sure. Folk will think I planted it there to throw them off. And did you? His eyes flared. No, ma'am. I've not been near the place in a week. Don't much care for sermons. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Then perhaps it is time to think about who would benefit from shifting suspicion from themselves onto you. Tom hesitated, then said, I did see someone near the runnel that morning. Just a glimpse, mind you. Could have been anyone in a dark coat. But they were carrying something under their arm, wrapped in a scarf. What sort of scarf? Looked like Vera Pellington's. She's got that green and gold one she wears all the time. But I didn't think much of it then. Thought she might be taking things to the fair. Miss Marple walked back across the green, her mind clicking over the pieces like a well-oiled mechanism. Vera at the church the night before the discovery, the velvet mark in the box, Tom's glimpse of a green and gold scarf near the runnel. If Vera had moved the box herself, it was to create a story in which the real line between Moor and murderer blurred. She suspected Inspector Cray would soon have questions for Vera, but Miss Marple also knew that when cornered, people did unpredictable things. And with the frost still holding, the Moor might yet yield another piece of evidence, if one knew where to look before it was brushed away. Would you like me to move Section 6 directly into the moment when a second, unexpected crime occurs, raising the stakes for everyone? It was 2 mornings later when Heatherford woke to the second shock. The frost was still thick on the ground, though the sky was lighter now, promising a brief spell of winter sun. Miss Marple was in her kitchen, coaxing the kettle into a proper boil, when a hurried knock came at her back door. Lydia Gray stood there, pale and wide-eyed, her breath puffing in the cold. Miss Marple, she gasped, there's been another one. At the King's Bell. Cyril Dove. Miss Marple set down the teapot. Dead? Lydia nodded, swallowing hard. Webb says so. Found him in the card room early this morning before the pub opened. The landlord went in to fetch a crate, and there he was. Miss Marple fetched her coat at once. Come along, my dear. You'll feel steadier walking. The King's Bell was a handsome old inn, its low beams and mullioned windows giving it an air of cheer entirely at odds with the scene inside. The front bar was empty, save for a couple of silent locals nursing their early pints. A side door stood open to the card room, where Inspector Cray loomed over a table laid out with an abandoned hand of whist. Cyril Dove sat slumped in a chair, his head at an unnatural angle, eyes half open as though in surprise. Cray looked up as Miss Marple entered, one brow lifting. Mrs. Marple, I can't say I'm surprised to see you. It appears someone's decided we didn't have enough to do with one murder. What happened? Landlord says the room was locked last night after the Thursday game, Cray said. He opened up about an hour ago, found Dove just as you see. No sign of a struggle, but there's a bruise on the back of the head. Could have been a fall, or a deliberate crack with something blunt. Doctor's on his way. Miss Marple's eyes traveled around the room. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and stale ale. On the floor near the table leg was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Face down in a small smear of what looked like damp earth. She bent, carefully righted it with the edge of a handkerchief, and turned it over. The back was scuffed, as though it had been scraped across a rough surface. Did Mr. Dove often stay behind after the game? She asked. Sometimes, Cray said. Landlord says he liked to settle accounts in private. Could be he met someone here after hours. The question is whether it was about money or something to do with Pellington. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the Queen of Spades. Sometimes, Inspector, it is both. Money is rarely entirely separate from the reasons people dislike each other. Dr. Hargreaves arrived, brisk as ever. After a cursory examination, he announced that Cyril Dove had likely died sometime after 11 the previous night. The bruise on his head was consistent with a blow from a heavy object, perhaps one of the candlesticks on the mantel. As the body was removed, Webb appeared, carrying a folded scrap of paper. "Found this in Dove's waistcoat pocket," he said to Cray. Cray unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, the ink blotched. "Meet me after the game. King's Bell card room. Important. No signature, no time." "Well," Cray said grimly, "that's an invitation to trouble if ever I saw one." He glanced at Miss Marple. "Any guesses who sent it?" "Guesses are dangerous things, Inspector," she said mildly. "But I would suggest looking for someone whose fortunes have shifted in the last day or two. Someone for whom Mr. Dove's silence or absence might be worth securing." By midday, the village knew of Dove's death. Gossip moved even faster now, the connections between the two crimes being drawn with a mixture of logic and wild fancy. Some swore that Dove had been Pellington's secret partner in some shady scheme. Others claimed the two men were rivals over a woman. Mrs. Blount, who always preferred her theories to have a moral edge, confided to anyone who would listen that the card table was a breeding ground for sin, and that she was not at all surprised to see it end in murder. Miss Marple, however, spent the afternoon not in speculation, but in quiet calls. She went first to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the postponed fair. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lyle, was in a flutter over the news. 2 deaths in less than a week, Miss Marple. It's not to be borne. And to think Cyril sat in that very pew last Sunday. I do wonder what the inspector will do now. I imagine he will ask himself who benefits most from both men being gone, Miss Marple said. Tell me, Mrs. Lyle, do you recall if Vera Pellington ever attended the Thursday card game? Mrs. Lyle blinked. Not that I know of, but Arthur often did, and sometimes Cyril walked her home after she came to fetch him. Said it was too cold for her to walk alone. How very considerate, Miss Marple murmured. From the vicarage, she walked to Lydia Gray's cottage. Lydia was mending a sleeve at her work table, the lamplight showing the quick, neat motion of her needle. Miss Marple, she said, do you think the 2 murders are connected? I think it would be very surprising if they were not, Miss Marple replied. But the nature of the connection may be less obvious than we suppose. Tell me, when you mended Arthur Pellington's black coat, was it after the last fair or before? After, Lydia said. He caught it on the churchyard gate one evening. I remember because Vera brought it herself. Said it was to be mended quickly. Paid me in coin straight from her own purse. And you returned it to Vera? Yes. She said she'd put it straight back in Arthur's wardrobe. Lydia frowned. Why do you ask? Miss Marple smiled. Because sometimes garments have more adventures than their owners realize. As she left Lydia's, the air was thickening with a low, creeping mist. She took the long way home, passing the edge of the moor where the frost lay undisturbed except for a single set of fresh footprints, heavy and wide-spaced, leading towards the stile by the runnel. She stopped, bent to examine them. The heel marks were deep, the tread pattern coarse. Work boots, perhaps. The frost around one print was smudged, as though something had been dropped there briefly. She found a small scrap of paper, half frozen into the surface. It was torn, the writing blurred, but 2 words were still legible. Card debt. She stood a moment longer, listening to the silence. The Moor had a way of holding its secrets in plain sight, waiting for the right pair of eyes to see them. She tucked the scrap into her pocket and continued home. That evening, there was a knock at her door. It was Inspector Cray, looking tired but alert. "Mrs. Marple," he said, "I thought you'd want to know. We've had the handwriting on Dove's note compared. It's a match for Vera Pellington." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then perhaps it is time to ask her what was so important after the game, last night." Cray's jaw tightened. "I intend to, but I have a feeling she'll not give it to me straight. Between you and me, I think she's deeper in this than she'll admit." Miss Marple met his gaze evenly. "Perhaps, Inspector. Or perhaps she is covering for someone else entirely. The trouble with people who are practiced at concealment is that they sometimes hide the wrong thing." Cray gave a short laugh. "You'll have to explain that one to me when this is over." "When it is over," Miss Marple said softly, "we may find that the most important clue was not what people did, but when they chose to do it, and why." The mist was thick outside now, muffling the lamps along the lane. Somewhere out there, someone was moving carefully, weighing their next step, knowing that 2 deaths in such quick succession could not be mistaken for chance. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the fire, the scrap of paper on her knee. Card debt. It was not much, but it linked Pellington and Dove in a way that neither gossip nor surface quarrels could explain away. And if there was a third name on that debt, a name the killer was desperate to keep hidden, then the frost on the moor might yet bear the weight of another body before the week was out. Would you like me to take Section 7 straight into Vera's interrogation and the subtle slip that shifts suspicion yet again? Inspector Cray wasted no time. The very next morning, while the frost was still holding to the garden walls and the church bell had only just finished its 9:30 chime, he walked up Fox Lane with Constable Webb in tow. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near her window with a perfectly innocent piece of mending, saw the 2 men mount Vera Pellington's steps. She knew better than to follow too soon. People spoke differently when they believed their audience small. It was nearly half an hour later when she tapped politely at Vera's door, carrying a covered plate of seed cake. "In case you've had no appetite, my dear." Webb, who opened the door, hesitated, but then stepped aside. The inspector was in the parlor, seated opposite Vera, whose composure was as rigid as the high-backed chair she occupied. "We were just discussing," Cray said in a tone that was almost genial, "a certain note found in Mr. Dove's pocket. Mrs. Pellington tells me she did indeed write it." Vera inclined her head. "I told you, Inspector. I asked Cyril to meet me after the Thursday game. It was about Arthur's death. I thought he might know something. He and Arthur were friends of a sort." "Friends?" Cray's tone sharpened. "Landlord says they argued 2 weeks ago over a debt. Something to do with the Thursday game." Vera's eyes flickered, but she held her ground. Arthur was particular about debts being settled promptly. Cyril didn't care for being pressed. But that was nothing to do with me. I only wanted to ask if Cyril had seen anyone near the moor that morning. "And you met him?" Her gaze dropped for a moment. "I went to the King's Bell after the game, yes. But when I arrived, the card room was dark and empty. I waited in the bar for a few minutes and then came home. I assumed he'd forgotten or chosen not to come." "That's not what the landlord says," Cray remarked. "He saw you near the side door just before closing." Vera's lips tightened. "I was looking for him. When I didn't find him, I left." Miss Marple, who had seated herself quietly with her plate of cake, spoke for the first time. "And the coat you wore, my dear? The black one with the velvet collar?" Vera glanced sharply at her. "No, the navy. I told you before, I haven't worn the black in days." "How curious," Miss Marple said mildly, "because I believe the mark inside the recovered cash box would match that velvet perfectly. One does wonder how it came there." For the first time, a flush rose in Vera's cheeks. "I may have worn it earlier in the week. Perhaps I forgot. But that doesn't prove I moved the box." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "It only suggests the box and the coat were in the same place at the same time." Cray leaned forward. "Mrs. Pellington, I'm going to be plain with you. 2 men are dead. Your note was in one's pocket. Your coat may connect you to stolen money from the other. If you're protecting someone, you'd better think hard about whether they do the same for you." Vera's eyes flashed. "You think I'm shielding Tom Yates? Or Lydia Gray? Or who exactly?" "I think," Cray said, "you know more than you're telling, and I think you'd better be very careful from here on." He stood, signaling the end of the interview. "We'll speak again." After he left with Webb, Vera sat very still, the silence thick around her. Then she turned to Miss Marple. "You believe I'm lying?" "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "I believe you are choosing your truths. We all do when we think the whole truth will harm someone we care for. But the difficulty is that half-truths are often more dangerous than lies." Vera's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. "Arthur could be cruel. You must have noticed. He enjoyed finding people's weaknesses, holding them up to the light. That sort of man collects enemies without even noticing. But it wasn't me who—" She broke off, biting her lip. "If I tell you something, will you promise it stays between us until I say otherwise?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I could not promise that, not where murder is concerned. But you may tell me what you will, and I will use it only to see justice done." Vera hesitated, then stood abruptly. "Number I can't. Not yet." She left the room without another word. Miss Marple walked back across the green, her mind busy. Vera had been on the edge of disclosure, but fear had pulled her back. Fear for herself? Or for someone else? At the grocer's, she encountered Mrs. Finch, who was brimming with the latest tidbit. "Did you hear? Young Eddie Partridge swears he saw Lydia Gray near the church after choir practice the night before they found the cash box. Says she was carrying something wrapped in cloth. Could have been the box, if you ask me." "That is interesting," Miss Marple said. "And did Eddie mention what color the cloth was?" Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "Dark green, he says, like that scarf Vera Pellington always wears." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured and continued on her way. That evening, she took a quiet turn around the village before supper. The frost crunched underfoot and lamps glowed behind curtains. As she passed Lydia's cottage, she saw the seamstress at her work table, head bent over her stitching. On impulse, Miss Marple tapped at the window. Lydia came to the door, surprise in her eyes. "Miss Marple, is something wrong?" "No, my dear. I was just passing. I wondered, do you ever mend scarves as well as coats?" Lydia smiled faintly. "Of course. I've just finished repairing a tear in Mrs. Pellington's green and gold one. She brought it to me last week." "And when did you return it?" 2 days ago. She collected it herself." Lydia tilted her head. "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, only that I think it must be a very versatile scarf." She walked home in the growing dark, her thoughts settling into place. Vera's scarf in Lydia's hands before the murders, the coat with the velvet collar, the box in the church, and now a note summoning Dove to his death. The connections were tightening, and somewhere in them lay the truth about what had happened on the moor. When she reached her own gate, she found a scrap of paper tucked into the latch. The handwriting was cramped, hurried. Meet me at the stile by the runnel. Midnight. Come alone. No signature, but Miss Marple recognized the hand. She had seen it often enough in the labels Lydia Gray pinned to her finished mending. Miss Marple stood in the cold, the note in her hand, and felt the quiet certainty that the next step in this dangerous game was about to be played. Whether it was a move towards the truth or a trap, she could not yet tell. But she would go, and she would not go unprepared. Would you like me to take Section 8 into that midnight meeting at the stile, where the danger becomes sharply personal for Miss Marple? The night came down thin and brittle, the kind of cold that sandpapers the inside of the nose and makes each breath sound larger than it is. Miss Marple dressed sensibly, without fuss. Stout boots, a dark shawl wound under her coat, a small electric torch tucked into her pocket, but not switched on, and, because she had learned in a long life that prudence was only common sense in another frock, a note left under the jam pot on her kitchen table for Inspector Cray, stating the hour and the place, and that she would be taking a turn to clear her head. She did not ask him to come. That sort of asking made men feel obliged to make a show. But she had a reasonable expectation that the note would be read sooner than later. If it were, all the better. If not, she would still go. Heatherford after 11 was a quilt pulled over a sleeping child. A few windows glowed. Most did not. The lane to the moor held a pale smear of frost, bright where the hedges opened, gray where branches arched and caught the cold. Somewhere a fox barked, carrying across the flatness with the clarity of glass struck by a fingertip. Miss Marple walked without hurry, cane tapping lightly, each step measuring the quiet as one measures a room. The stile by the runnel crouched where the hedgerow broke to allow the narrow field path its old right-of-way. The iron catch, with its telltale jag, was a blacker shadow against the night. The runnel itself trickled, never quite freezing, whispering over stones. She stood a little short of the stile and listened. Waiting had always told her more than questions did. It was some minutes before she heard the careful step behind her on the lane, the kind that tries to be noiseless and succeeds only in being deliberate. She did not turn. When Lydia Gray's small figure slipped out of the hedgerow's darker edge, Miss Marple saw at once that she had been weeping. The lamplight from the village could not reach here, but a person's posture has its own illumination. "You came," Lydia whispered. "I thought... I wasn't sure you would, after what's happened." "My dear, you asked me," Miss Marple said gently. "And I have always found that women who mend other people's tears are rarely the sort to rip their own lives without reason. Tell me." Lydia's breath plumed. She clasped and unclasped her hands. "I didn't tell the inspector everything about the box. I should have, I suppose. It's just... I thought perhaps I could set it right without making it worse." "Setting things right is a fine ambition," Miss Marple said. "Only one must know where right is. Start at the beginning." Lydia darted a look down the path as if expecting the night to answer for her. "The night before the fair, there was a knock at my door. Late. I thought it was Mrs. Blount with another of her urgent hems, but it was Mr. Dove. He was nervous. He said Arthur had been foolish, he used that word, and that there was money Arthur ought not to have kept about him. He said Arthur had promised to bring the float straight to the vicarage after choir practice, but instead he'd gone walking. "People will talk," Cyril said. "Do you want them talking about you as well, Miss Gray?" And then he said something. He said he knew about my brother's trouble last year, the bills, how the vicar's fund paid them. He said if I helped, no one need know. "What did he ask you to do?" Miss Marple kept her tone mild, as if inquiring about a recipe. "To put the box somewhere it would be found, but not too soon. He said the church was best. 'Holy hands make clean,' he said and laughed, but only with his mouth. He asked if I had something to wrap it in, so he wouldn't be seen carrying it. The only thing to hand was Mrs. Pellington's scarf. She'd left it with me to mend a pulled thread. I know I shouldn't have. I wrapped the box and gave it to him. He carried it her voice shook. Like a man carrying a baby he was afraid to drop. He said he'd take it to the church when the choir men had gone and leave it safe. "You've done a good thing," he told me. "You've saved a woman from tongues." "Which woman?" Miss Marple asked, though she could guess. Lydia's silence said as much as words. He didn't say, but later, after Arthur, when the talk began, I thought it must be Mrs. Pellington. I took the scarf back to her as soon as I had finished it, 2 days after, and she looked at it as if it might burn her hands. That was when I knew, or thought I did. "And the note that brought Mr. Dove to the card room after the game?" Miss Marple asked. "Did you know of it?" Lydia shook her head hard. "Number, I swear it. I didn't even know he meant to meet anyone." "Miss Marple, I only meant to keep people from thinking the money had been stolen to say something ugly about Mrs. Pellington. But then Mr. Dove, and now I think I've made everything worse. And if the inspector learns I was the one who wrapped the box..." Miss Marple laid a hand very lightly on Lydia's sleeve. "My dear, you have done a foolish kindness. There are worse sins." From beyond the hedgerow came the faintest rasp, like a boot sole testing a root. Miss Marple did not start. She let the silence run out as if the night had a spool. She was holding the thread between finger and thumb. Whoever was listening had edged closer. She felt, rather than saw, Lydia sway. "Go on," Miss Marple said, slightly louder, as if to reassure an anxious confidant. "You gave Cyril the box. Did you see him again that night?" "Number. But I saw a man cross the lane a little later when I went to latch my shutters. He had his collar up and a cap pulled down. He walked with a sort of..." Lydia groped. "Purpose. I thought nothing of it then. Only today I remembered the way he held his arm close, like someone who'd slipped something long under his coat." "Like a cane," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes. Tall, short, average, but heavy in the foot." The hedgerow breathed. Miss Marple shifted a fraction, putting herself between Lydia and the stile's sudden drop. "And there is something else," she said conversationally, as if talking to the frost. "Men who work with their hands carry their work about them, under their nails, in the nicks on their skin, in the powder on their cuffs. Carpenters take home shavings. Painters wear their ladders on their sleeves. People think they wash these things away. They don't." Lydia made a small, frightened sound. "Is someone..." "Hush, child," Miss Marple murmured. A shadow detached itself from the hedge with the abruptness of a bird breaking cover. It came fast, too fast for a meeting, and the hard shove was aimed not at Miss Marple, whom it underestimated, but at Lydia, to send her flailing against the stile's slick top rail and down into the runnel's dark. Miss Marple had already taken a step that made the shove glance. Even so, Lydia's heel skidded. Miss Marple's cane shot out and hooked, an old woman's habit of being in the right place made suddenly useful. Lydia's fall turned into a sit with a gasp and a tearing of wool. "Now then," Miss Marple said, and there was a briskness in it that had steadied many a nursery mishap. That was clumsy. The figure swore, a breathy sound, and lunged again. A whistle split the cold like a knife. Constable Webb came out of the hedgerow behind the attacker the way a firm hand comes down on a naughty child, and another shape moved low and fast from the field side. Inspector Cray, who had bent to the inconvenience of a ditch and come up with mud to his knees and attempered a match. "Stand where you are," Cray snapped. The shadow twisted, wrenched free of Webb's grasp at the cost of a ripping sound and a grunt, and plunged for the field. Cray hurled himself and missed by inches. A dark cap clipped a thorn bush and vanished into mist. The heavy footfalls thudded across rime and were eaten by distance. Webb stood panting, a strip of cloth in his fist. He held it up. Even in the poor light, the threads gleamed faintly. "Sir," Miss Marple did not need the inspector's torch to know the color. Green, braided with gold, a fringe torn jagged where the hedge had held it. Cray's mouth went hard. "Mrs. Pellington's scarf." Lydia's hand flew to her throat. "I mended that fringe. I'd know it anywhere." Cray turned his torch on the ground where the struggle had been. Frost scuffed white to gray. A deep print showed the heel and part of a tread, with a small nick out of the heel rubber at the outer edge. Beside it lay a short, stubby pencil, the sort used to mark wood, blue chalk smeared along one side. "Painters or joiners," Webb said, bending. "Chalk line," Miss Marple observed. "Tom Yates uses red. He says blue confuses him in lamplight." She looked not at Webb or Cray, but at the stiles iron. On the rough edge, a smear caught her eye. Darker than frost, duller than water. She touched it with a folded square of her handkerchief and brought it to the light. A faint powder of blue, the kind that does not sink into cloth but clings to fibers. A cousin to the paint that had marked Arthur Pellington's cane. Cray saw the same. "Our man's been at a site," he said, "or in a shed." "Not Tom's," Miss Marple said calmly. "He is proud in his small way, and keeps his pots capped and his pencils in a tin. He told me so once with the self-importance of a schoolboy. I should think Mr. Hollis less particular." She added the last as if thinking aloud, and not because she expected the name to land with a weight it had not yet had in their conversations. "Hollis?" Webb said, startled. "The wheelwright?" "He has lately fancied himself a furniture restorer," Miss Marple said. "He came to Tom for a chair leg, you will remember, on the morning of Arthur's death, at an hour that suggests urgency, not leisure. He wears heavy boots and a cap and walks like a man who has taught his feet to be more than feet. And," she added gently, "he plays in the Thursday game." Cray's brows went up. "Does he?" Lydia, sitting carefully now on the safe side of the stile, looked from one to the other. "But why would he?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "debt is a cord that cuts when pulled too tight. Mr. Hollis has been too proud to ask for help. Men like that call it a favor when they lend, and a robbery when they must repay. If Arthur pressed him, and Cyril tried to keep him quiet." Cray made a soft sound that was not agreement, but not disbelief. "It's a line of inquiry," he said, and crouched to take a plaster cast of the heel with a competence that surprised Miss Marple pleasantly. "We'll look at Hollis's boots and his shed." Webb offered Lydia a hand. "Are you hurt, Miss Gray?" "Only frightened," she whispered. "I thought he came out of nowhere." "Desperation does that," Miss Marple said. "It turns corners into opportunities." She looked at the torn scarf fringe in Webb's hand. "May I?" When he assented, she ran a forefinger over the weave. "You mended this differently, Lydia. See? On the third tassel you used a tighter tension. You had to— the old threads were too rubbed." She looked up, her eyes very kind. "It means whoever tore this tonight had the scarf after you returned it, and used it as men use the nearest thing that will serve, not as a woman uses something beloved." Cray straightened. "We'll visit Mrs. Pellington now, before anyone has time to hold a bonfire," he said. He glanced at Miss Marple. "You have the gift of being precisely where I would like you to be." "It is not a gift," Miss Marple said modestly. "It is only a habit of living where other people are likely to be ill-advised." He gave a short huff that might have been a laugh if he were not cold and exasperated. And he and Webb set off at a clip, Webb keeping the torn fringe carefully, as if it might wriggle away. When the night was quiet again, Miss Marple stood with Lydia beside the runnel until the young woman's breathing slowed. Then she walked her back as far as the cottage door, where the little lamp in the window made a circle of warmth on the frost. Lydia caught her sleeve. "I didn't forge that note," she said suddenly, the words tumbling. "The one they say Mrs. Pellington wrote to Mr. Dove. I can copy a hem, but not a hand. I swear it. Only—" she bit her lip. "I have seen Mrs. Pellington's writing often. People ask me to sew their names into things. I keep their cards and scraps in a box to get the letters right. If someone else had that box for an hour, they could copy any hand in the village." Miss Marple felt, as one sometimes does, the quiet click of an extra tooth in a gear she had assumed complete. "Where do you keep this box?" "In my workroom. It's nothing, really, just bits." "And has anyone been very obliging about fetching or caring for you lately?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Someone who likes to be useful." Lydia frowned. "Mr. Hollis offered to bring a parcel to Mrs. Lyle last week. Said he was passing. I let him. I was busy." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Good night, my dear. Bolt your door. Sleep if you can." She walked home the long way, because the long way gave her time to think. Behind one set of shuttered windows, she saw a shadow move, a woman's profile, chin lifted in stubbornness or pride. Vera, she thought, keeping watch over her neat rooms, as if neatness were a magic that could keep chaos at bay. Behind another, she heard the scrape of a chair and the clink of a cup. Someone awake who should have been asleep. At Mr. Hollis's yard, the dark was thicker, the outline of the shed squat and ungiving. There was a smell in the air that people who did not work with their hands never notice. The sharp, dry tang of chalk and the faint sweetness of shavings damp at the edges. On her own doorstep, she paused and looked back at the frosted world. It glimmered innocently. But innocence, she reflected, is a quality of light, not of events. Someone had come to the stile not to confess, but to prevent confession. Someone had torn a scarf that did not belong to him and left behind a line of blue like the faintest bruise. Someone who thought, as men often do, that force was proof and quietness a weakness. In the kitchen, the kettle was cold. She warmed it, not because she wanted tea, but because it is good to do an ordinary thing after you have nearly been pushed into a ditch. As steam rose, she drew a small square of paper from her pocket, the fragment she had found on the moor with its blurred card debt, and held it beside the torn fringe. Debts could be made and hidden. Threads could be broken and mended. But textures remained. She laid the two on the table and sat a moment. In the morning, there would be talk, and men with boots would visit sheds, and a woman with a neat house would have to decide what truth she meant to own. For tonight, it was enough to know that desperation had shown its hand clumsily. The cleverness, as always, would be in the ordinary things. The chalk under a nail, the way a foot fell, the neatness of a mended edge, and in the quiet knowledge that people will always, always tell you who they are, if you let them. Inspector Cray was on Miss Marple's doorstep before 9, looking as if he'd slept little. The frost was thinner this morning, but the air still had the hard edge of winter. His boots left sharp prints on her path as he stepped inside without ceremony, Webb at his heels. "We went straight to Mrs. Pellington last night after the business at the stile," Cray said, unbuttoning his coat. "She admitted the scarf was hers, but swears she hasn't worn it since before Arthur's death. Claims it must have been stolen from her hall cupboard." "And was she able to suggest who might have stolen it?" Miss Marple asked, guiding them towards the kitchen table. "She named half the village," Cray said grimly. "Every caller she's had this week. Webb's checked her story. No one remembers seeing the scarf after Monday. But here's the interesting part. When we looked at Hollis's shed, we found the scarf shoved in a crate of old sacking, still damp from the frost, boots with a heel nick matching the print at the stile, and blue chalk powder on the floorboards. Webb produced a brown paper bag. Inside lay a stubby pencil, its point blunted and its side streaked with the same deep blue Miss Marple had noted the night before. "Mr. Hollis is denying everything, of course," Cray continued. "Says the scarf was left there by someone else, that plenty of men have been in and out of his shed lately. He's got a temper, snapped at Webb when we asked about Thursday night." Miss Marple poured tea for them both, setting the cups down with her usual neatness. "Did you ask him about Arthur Pellington's cane?" Cray's brow furrowed. "We did. He claims he never saw it. But the runnel fence has fresh scuffs in the paint where the cane ferrule would match perfectly. And he couldn't explain why his boots had frost pressed into the edges at a time when he says he was by his fire." Webb added, "We also found a scrap of paper under his bench. Looked like it had been torn from a larger sheet. Had writing on it, ink blotted, same hand as that note summoning Dove to the card room." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And yet, Inspector, if Hollis is our culprit, it seems curious that he would plant the cash box in the church himself and then attack Miss Gray to keep her silent. Why draw attention to the very person who could identify him?" "Perhaps he panicked," Cray said. "Perhaps he thought she'd overheard more than she did." "Possible," Miss Marple allowed. "But panicked men often flee, rather than seek out those who might talk. Unless, of course, they believe those people have something, evidence, perhaps, that could be used against them." Webb leaned forward. "Like what?" Miss Marple glanced at him over her teacup. "Like a box of name cards in a seamstress's workroom, for example. One which could be used to forge a note in anyone's hand." Cray's expression sharpened. "You think Hollis copied Vera's writing?" "I think someone did," Miss Marple said. "And Hollis's sudden helpfulness to Lydia last week suggests he had the opportunity to take those cards. The note to Dove was clever, designed to lure him somewhere quiet while leaving suspicion resting comfortably on Mrs. Pellington's shoulders." Cray sat back, his mind working. "So, Hollis kills Pellington over a debt, moves the box with the scarf to implicate Vera, then lures Dove to the bell because Dove knows too much? Or," Miss Marple said softly, "because Dove had begun to realize who was truly responsible for Arthur's death, and perhaps had hinted as much. Men like Mr. Hollis do not appreciate being cornered by talk." Webb frowned. "But why not just take the scarf from the start instead of using it later at the stile?" "Because," Miss Marple said, The scarf's second appearance was not part of his plan. That was desperation, an attempt to silence Lydia, when he realized she had been the unwitting link between him and the cash box. If Lydia told the inspector she had wrapped the box in Vera's scarf, then Mrs. Pellington might have been cleared far too quickly for his comfort. Cray drained his tea and stood. "We'll bring him in again. He's got more to answer for than he thinks." Miss Marple accompanied them to the door, watching as they strode away across the green. She knew the trap would have to be set carefully. Hollis was the sort of man who grew obstinate when pressed. But she also knew that obstinate men, when offered the right bait, would walk into a snare of their own making. By midday, the village was humming with news of Hollis's questioning. At the grocer's, Mrs. Finch whispered that the wheelwright had looked like thunder when Webb escorted him to the reading room. Mrs. Blount declared it high time someone of his temper was made to account for himself. Tom Yates, overhearing, muttered that Hollis had always thought himself better than the rest because he knew how to put a shine on a coffin lid. Miss Marple, for her part, kept her own counsel. Instead of lingering in the village, she walked out towards the moor, pausing at the stile. The frost was thinning now, but the marks from the struggle 2 nights before were still visible. The scuffed earth, the torn hedge where the scarf fringe had caught. She traced the iron catch with a gloved finger, thinking of the frayed threads on Arthur's coat and the mark in the cash box's dust. Small things, overlooked by most, but not by the person who had orchestrated this chain of events. That afternoon, Cray called again, his mood half satisfaction, half frustration. "We've got Hollis on the scarf, the chalk, and the boots," he said. He admits to being near the moor the morning of Pellington's death, but claims he was delivering the chair leg to Yates. Says he saw Pellington alive, walking towards the pool, and left him there. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And you believe him?" "I believe he's clever enough to mix truth and lies," Cray said. "We can't yet place him at the actual moment of the killing, and he's sticking to his story about Dove, that he never saw him after Thursday's game." "Then, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "you might persuade him to prove it." Cray gave her a sharp look. "How?" "Invite him to repeat the game," Miss Marple said mildly. "Same table, same players, same stakes. Men who cheat or kill over cards cannot resist showing how it should be done. And in the comfort of old habits, they forget to guard their tongues." By the time evening came, the reading room was lit and warm, the card table set just as it had been. Hollis sat opposite Tom Yates, with 2 other regulars filling the seats. Cray and Webb lingered in the background, and Miss Marple, knitting in the corner, might have been no more than a piece of furniture. The play began with the easy chatter of men at leisure. But as the hands were dealt, Miss Marple watched Hollis's eyes. When a queen of spades fell to the table, his gaze flickered. The same card found on the floor beside Dove's body. "Bad luck, that one," Tom Yates remarked. Hollis gave a short laugh. "Not if you know how to use her. Queen of spades will win you the game if you play her right." "Like you did Thursday?" Tom asked lightly. Hollis's smile was quick, too quick. "Maybe." Pellington was always easy to read. Dove, too, when he wasn't bluffing about what he knew. The room went still. Even the shuffle of cards paused. "What did Dove know?" Cray asked from the shadows. Hollis blinked, realizing too late the slip he had made. "Nothing worth killing over." "No one said killing," Cray said, stepping forward. "But you just did." Hollis pushed back his chair, but Webb was already behind him. The other players sat frozen as Cray laid the queen of spades from his own pocket on the table beside Hollis's cards. "Funny thing," Cray said, That card has a smear of the same blue chalk we found in your shed. Matches the mark on the one beside Dove's body. Matches the chalk on the stile. And I'd wager it'll match the paint on Pellington's cane, too." Hollis's shoulders dropped, the fight draining out of him. "All right," he muttered. "But you've got it wrong. It started with Pellington. Dove just—" He wouldn't keep his mouth shut. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "And so, Mr. Hollis, you found that killin' once makes it easier to kill again. But you forgot something." Hollis looked at her, weary and bitter. "What's that?" "That people notice the smallest things," she said gently. "A scrap of fringe, a dab of chalk, a card in the wrong place. And those things tell the truth, even when men do not." Cray nodded to Webb, who led Hollis away. The other players exhaled, as if the air had been held too long. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly. It was nearly midnight when she reached home, but the fire was still warm in the grate. She thought of Vera Pellington, whose name would soon be cleared, of Lydia Gray, whose foolish kindness had almost cost her life, and of the Moor, lying under its silver frost as if nothing had happened. Human nature, she reflected, left its mark as surely as a boot in the frozen grass. And, given the right light, those marks were impossible to miss. Shall I take Section 10 into the aftermath and Miss Marple's quiet summing up of the whole affair? The news of Hollis's arrest moved through Heatherford like a change in the weather, sudden, undeniable, and remarked upon in every doorway and over every shop counter. By mid-morning, Mrs. Finch had told the grocer twice, Mrs. Blount had told him thrice, and the grocer's boy had run to tell his aunt in the post office before returning with a packet of barley sugar and a face full of importance. It was the kind of news that made people lower their voices and lean in close, as though the walls themselves might wish to hear. For Miss Marple, there was nothing to rush for now. The dangerous part was done. The rest was the unpicking of a tangle she had already seen laid out in her mind. Still, she knew that a village's peace was best restored when people understood the truth, or at least enough of it to quiet the speculations that could grow poisonous if left to spread. Inspector Cray came to her cottage that afternoon. His manner was less harried than it had been in days, though there was still a set to his jaw that spoke of unfinished paperwork and lingering questions. "Thought you might like to know," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Hollis has made a full statement. Started off trying to make it sound like self-defense, but in the end, it all came out. You were right, Mrs. Marple. The whole thing began with a card debt." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Arthur Pellington's debt?" "Number Hollis's." "To Pellington. Seems Pellington loaned him a tidy sum to finish a piece of work for a customer, then demanded repayment almost before the paint was dry. Hollis couldn't manage it. They argued, more than once by the sound of it. On the morning of the fair, Pellington told Hollis he meant to speak to the other players at the Thursday game about it, to make sure no one else extended him credit. Hollis followed him onto the moor, tried to talk him round. There was a struggle by the runnel. Hollis shoved him. He fell, hit his head on a stone. Dead before Hollis knew what had happened. Miss Marple's expression was grave. "And the cash box?" "Pellington had it with him, planning to take it to the vicarage. Hollis took it, meaning to hide it until he could think what to do. Used Mrs. Pellington's scarf because it was to hand. He'd fetched something from her house a day or two before. Hid the box in his shed at first, then decided the church would be safer. That's where Miss Gray comes in." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She told me of Mr. Dove's visit." Cray nodded. Dove knew Hollis had the box, saw him near the shed that morning. Dove had been in hock to Pellington himself and thought he could use that knowledge to squeeze a bit out of Hollis. Told him if he didn't share, he'd tell the inspector. Hollis played along, asked him to meet after Thursday's game, forged that note to make it look like Mrs. Pellington had sent it. Once Dove was in the card room, Hollis hit him from behind with one of the candlesticks. Took less than a minute. Cold-blooded, Miss Marple murmured. Calculated, Cray said. He even planted the Queen of Spades from his own chalk-marked deck near Dove's body, so if the card was noticed it might look like some gambler's quarrel. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, it was the very smallness of those details, the chalk, the fringe, the placement of a card, that undid him. The human mind is often careless with large things, Inspector, but rarely with the small, familiar ones. Cray gave a short laugh. And I'll admit, it was those small things you pointed out that gave me the push. Webb's taken the scarf to Mrs. Pellington. She's shaken, but I think she'll come round once she realizes she's well out of it. When Cray had gone, Miss Marple sat a while longer, thinking. She thought of Lydia Gray's frightened eyes at the stile, of Tom Yates's defensive posture when suspicion had hovered over him, of Vera Pellington's stiff-necked pride. She thought, too, of Hollis. Not with pity, but with the quiet understanding that people often bring about their own ruin by overestimating their cleverness and underestimating others. The next day, Vera Pellington called at Miss Marple's cottage. She was neatly dressed, her gloves immaculate, but there was a faint slackness to her shoulders that had not been there before. I came to thank you, she said, sitting in the chair by the fire. Inspector Cray told me you were instrumental in clearing my name. I can't say I liked being under suspicion, but I like even less the idea that Arthur's death came from something as sordid as money and cards. Human motives are often sordid, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. That is why they are so effective. I am glad for your sake that the truth is known. Vera's mouth tightened. I've been thinking. Perhaps Arthur was too fond of making others feel small. Perhaps that was part of it. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps I too have been guilty of that. I shall try to do better. Miss Marple inclined her head. It is never too late to improve one's manners in great things or small. Vera left soon after, and Miss Marple went out to the green. The Winter Fair Committee had decided to reschedule for the new year, and already there was talk of raffles and bake sales, as though murder had never paused their plans. The bunting was still stored away, but Mrs. Blount was on the green with a notebook, marshalling volunteers with her usual brisk authority. Lydia Gray crossed from the grocer's, a skein of yarn under her arm. She stopped when she saw Miss Marple. I can't thank you enough, she said. If you hadn't, well, I don't know what might have happened. You were brave to tell the truth when it was hardest to do so, Miss Marple said. That counts for more than you may realize. Lydia smiled faintly, then went on her way. That evening, the frost returned, settling over Heatherford like a clean sheet. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, the familiar rhythm steadying her thoughts. She considered how the whole affair had been, at heart, a very ordinary story. A man with debts, another man with power over him, and the fragile pride that made each unable to yield. Everything else, the cash box, the forged note, the scarf, the card, had been the layers people put over their motives, like the neat covers on a chair with broken springs. She reflected, too, on how quickly the village would return to its gentle routines once the talk had settled. Children would skate on the frozen pond. Mrs. Finch would gossip about the fair prizes. Mrs. Lyle would choose hymns for Christmas. Life would go on, as it always did, smoothing over the jagged edges with a layer of ordinary days. And yet, under that surface, Heatherford would remember. Some would remember the fear, others the shame, and a few, perhaps the wiser few, would remember that small details matter, and that there is often more to be learned from what is not said than from what is spoken aloud. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and poured herself a final cup of tea. Outside, the moon shone pale over the frosted moor, the runnel whispering softly in the distance. She thought of Arthur Pellington, of Cyril Dove, and of the chain of decisions that had led to 2 deaths and a dozen secrets stirred into the open. Human nature, she thought, was much the same as the frost. It could be beautiful, treacherous and revealing all at once. And under the right light, it showed every mark left upon it. With that thought, she sipped her tea, the fire warm on her face, and allowed the quiet of the winter night to settle around her, knowing that for now at least, Heatherford's troubles were at rest. The inquest was set for the following Tuesday, and in Heatherford even Tuesdays can feel ceremonial when the whole village makes a point of keeping its voice down. The frost held, though there was a softening in the afternoons that turned the verges into a rime-streaked paste before the evening's chill restored their brittle dignity. Miss Marple walked to the parish hall with her customary unhurried step and her small black bag that contained, as ever, nothing more alarming than a handkerchief, a tin of pastilles, and a notebook in which the grocery list kept company with the names of people's dogs. The coroner's business was brisk. Statements read, findings noted, the doctor's cool recital of bruises and timings setting a restraint around emotions that might otherwise have spilled. Arthur Pellington, death by violence, consistent with a blow to the head, sustained during a struggle near the frosted pool. Cyril Dove, death by a fractured skull, struck from behind in the Kingsbell card room. In both cases, the jury's verdicts followed where Inspector Cray's evidence pointed. Mr. Hollis as the responsible hand. There was no audible triumph in the room, only a collective loosening, like a breath that had been held through a long hymn and released on the final amen. Afterwards, people came up to Miss Marple as if to a pew end, to speak softly and thank her for nothing in particular. She stood in her mild way and accepted their gratitude as one accepts the weather. Vera Pellington approached last. She wore a hat with a discreet veil that did nothing to hide the new set to her mouth. Not grief exactly, but a decision to live with something one would rather not have to live with. "Miss Marple," she said, "I have been thinking. Arthur's affairs will need settling. I intend to return the difference between what he lent and what he demanded to those he pressed hardest." She paused. That may be considered foolish, but it is the only way I can bear his memory in this place. I think, Miss Marple said, that people will understand the kind of tidiness that is moral rather than domestic, and if they do not, it will still be worth doing. On the green later, the ordinary asserted itself with admirable insistence. Mrs. Blount, who had avoided looking at Vera all morning and therefore could not be accused of staring, conferred with the vicar over dates for the rescheduled fair. Children skated brief, slithering tracings on the thinnest ice near the pond's edge, while mothers called sharp warnings that were as much tradition as prudence. Tom Yates, his cap pushed back, hammered a stray nail into the notice board and straightened to find Miss Marple beside him with the tolerant smile of someone who chooses to remember a boy's better report cards. "You were treated shabbily," she said. Tom's ears reddened. "I was cross enough to deserve some of it. say foolish things when I'm cornered. Most of us do, Miss Marple said. It is when people are not cornered and still choose foolishness that one must worry. He ducked his head and after an awkward moment added, I took a stool to Lydia this morning. The leg didn't wobble when I left. I am delighted for the stool, Miss Marple said, which made him laugh and look, for the first time in days, entirely young. Inspector Cray found her at dusk, as lights pricked the windows one by one, and the air took on that metallic chill that anticipates night. He had a folder under his arm, and the conscious air of a man not wishing to trespass and knowing he was expected. "You've a minute for a last tidy?" he asked, half rueful. Miss Marple led him into her little parlor, where the fire had learned by long acquaintance how to burn cheerfully without fuss. He stood by the mantel, glancing at the framed samplers as if they might conceal diagrams of criminal habits. "You were right in every particular that mattered," he said. Hollis admitted he forged the note to Dove. He took it from a sample of Mrs. Pellington's hand, her Christmas list from last year, as it happens, lifted from Miss Gray's box of name cards when he did that errand she mentioned. He wrapped the cash box in the scarf after taking it from Lydia. Said he thought it poetic. He has the sort of imagination that flowers only in selfish soils. Miss Marple said, which was agreement and regret together. And the cane? In the runnel hedging. We fished it out this morning. The ferrule had blue paint that matches the style, and a smear of that same chalk he drops everywhere. We'll be able to put him precisely where he says he wasn't. Cray looked at her, amusement flickering. I confess I liked your suggestion at the reading room. Men who boast they never make mistakes give themselves away at the card table quicker than anywhere else. It is a place, Miss Marple observed, where people reveal whether they prefer luck to skill and whether they can bear to lose. Cray drew out a chair, but did not sit. There is one nuisance left. Some are saying Pellington's death was half an accident. Hollis's way of telling it makes him sound unlucky rather than murderous. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Most killings that are not planned carefully begin as something smaller. A shove because one is angry at being made to feel small. A blow because talking has failed and pride is hurt. Then the suddenness of a head-striking stone and the coldness of fear that follows. To call it accident is to forget everything the man did after the first moment. He hit a box. He forged a note. He lured and struck a second time. He tried to push a frightened girl into a ditch. That is a path, Inspector, not a stumble. Cray nodded slowly. That is what I shall say when they ask me on the stand, in fewer words. She smiled. Fewer will do. When he had gone, Miss Marple allowed herself the small satisfaction of putting away her notebook. On its last page she had copied the list the grocer's boy kept for Mrs. Blount: sugar, flour, candles, 2 reels of green thread. Because it pleased her, now and then, to see the homely in the grave written in the same hand. It keeps a person honest, she thought, to remember that a clue and a shopping list may look much alike until one reads them. 2 days later, Vera Pellington's parlor looked different in ways that only women notice. The photograph of Arthur had been moved from the center of the mantel to the side. The velvet-collared coat hung no longer in the wardrobe, but in a bag on the back bedroom door, ready to go to a cousin in Bath who was larger and less particular. Vera came to the door without gloves and did not apologize for it. I've brought you something, she said to Miss Marple, holding out a small parcel. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay the green and gold scarf, its fringe neatly mended again by Lydia's careful hand. I find I cannot bear it, Vera said quietly. would you see that it goes to someone who will put warmth on it rather than stories? Miss Marple touched the fabric with a fingertip. I will see that it is used for winter and not for drama. Vera's eyes softened. You're very good at knowing which is which. I have had a long time to practice, Miss Marple said. The winter fair, when it came in January, had an air of recovery about it that suited the new year. Children carried paper lanterns that bumped against one another like polite fish in a bowl. The brass band produced more enthusiasm than harmony. Mrs. Lyle held a cake auction with the zeal of a woman who has discovered her calling rather later in life than most. Tom Yates's carpentry stall had a queue for his little footstools, and if Lydia stood beside him now and then to take coins and make change, no one was indecorous enough to remark on it beyond a smile too private to be gossip. Miss Marple moved through it all like a small island of calm in a lively river. She bought barley sweets from the grocer because they had been on Arthur's last list, and such things, she had found, ought not to become mementos when they can be reassigned as treats. She admired a quilt, judged a jar of jam with more seriousness than jam requires, and took from Mrs. Blount a strip of tickets for the grand prize, which turned out, fittingly, to be a sensible kettle. It was late afternoon when Inspector Cray appeared at her side, hands in pockets, looking less like a policeman than a man trying to decide whether to have a second slice of seed cake. We'll be done with the paperwork by week's end, he said. Hollis will be sent for trial. Webb's had his first proper night's sleep since Advent, and I've been congratulated by 3 people who wouldn't have lent me a cup of sugar last month. Enjoy it while it lasts, Miss Marple said. People will soon forget they like the police and go back to liking private certainty. He laughed. And you? Will you miss the fuss? I prefer my puzzles in knitting, she said. They are easier to unpick and do not bleed. They stood companionably, watching the lanterns wink to life as the sky grew deeper. Snow threatened, the honest kind that falls, without malice, and puts white caps on things that have no business wearing hats. Miss Marple thought of the Moor and its winter light, of the runnel that had told a quiet truth while people said louder things that were not true, of the Queen of Spades and what men pretend she means, and of a short, stubby pencil that had left a line of blue like a signature a man did not know he had written. That evening, back in her cottage, she set the sensible kettle on the hob and sorted through a little pile of odds and ends she kept in a drawer. A torn fringe returned by Webb when the case was closed, a smudge-streaked card from the King's Bell that the landlord had insisted she take as a souvenir, if you'll allow. The tiny scrap with card debt almost faded now to invisibility. She laid them in a row and looked at them not as relics, but as punctuation marks in a story that had required careful reading. Then she wrapped them in brown paper and string, wrote "To be burned when forgotten" on the top, and put the parcel away. Some things deserve to be remembered only long enough to make their lesson permanent. Outside, the first flakes began, generous and slow. Miss Marple drew the curtains and sat, cup in hand, reflecting that the village would talk this case into a neat shape, and then place it high on a shelf in its memory. Next to the year the river froze hard enough for a cart, and the summer the roses came early. That was as it should be. The living must arrange their recollections so that daily life can proceed. She thought of Vera's resolve, of Tom's awkward gratitude, of Lydia's courage when it would have been easier to keep quiet, and of Inspector Cray's willingness to hear a small old woman say that a thing was so. There is more heroism in such ordinary choices, she believed, than in any of the glittering sort that makes for headlines. The frost had made everything visible. The thaw had allowed people to decide how to live with what they had seen. When the clock chimed 9, she set down her cup and took up her knitting again. The wool ran smooth over her fingers, obedient and warm. Somewhere across the lane, a child laughed. Further off, a door closed with that particular softness that means someone has decided not to wake a sleeping house. Miss Marple smiled into the quiet and counted stitches, steady and exact, content with the pleasing knowledge that, for the moment, Heatherford's pattern held. Snow fell steadily through the night and into the morning, the kind that accumulates without fuss, making domes of the gateposts and smoothing every footprint into an even white. The village woke late, or at least behaved as if it had. There is something about a thick fall that persuades people to move more quietly. Miss Marple drew back the curtain to find her small world softened, the hawthorn hedge like a lace cuff, and the lane muffled so completely that even the milkman's clatter had a courteous sound to it. She set the kettle on, tidied the tray against habit rather than need, and went to the door when she heard the post slide in with its neat, apologetic thump. There were 3 envelopes in a brown paper parcel tied with string. The first envelope was from Bath, the hand unknown. Inside, a short, sensible note from a Mrs. Armitage thanked Miss Marple for facilitating the gift of a velvet-collared coat. "It fits my husband as if cut to his measure," the note read, "and if I am honest, it will do him good to feel arrayed handsomely without the expense. Men behave better, in my experience, when their collars sit straight." Miss Marple smiled and tucked the letter beside the clock to show Vera later if it seemed useful to her peace. The second letter carried the county stamp, a schedule of hearings, with Hollis's name among them, a date ringed in blue pencil. There was nothing in it Miss Marple had not expected, but she read it through because reading through was a discipline that had saved her from error more times than anyone knew. The third was a small card from Lydia, the ink careful. "Tom brought me a stool with no wobble," she had written, and asked if I would put his name on a cuff now and again, if I ever took it into my head to change it. I told him names should be used a long time before they're mended. He laughed and asked if I minded practicing. Miss Marple's smile deepened and turned inward, the kind of smile that is not for show. She left the parcel to last. It was light, and something inside slid a little when she turned it. The King's Bell landlord had sent round a note with it in his square, self-important hand. "If you please, ma'am, a token from us, with compliments." In the parcel lay a deck of cards, the kind used at the Thursday game, but with the Queen of Spades removed and replaced by a blank. On top of the pack, wrapped in tissue, lay the missing queen, scrubbed clean of chalk and set in a cheap brass frame. No more than a joke, but one that had about it a countryman's sense that a thing that had done harm might be blunted by turning it into a keepsake. Miss Marple set the frame on the dresser behind the jam pot, where it looked more like a reminder than a trophy, and where it would not startle anyone who did not already know. By late morning, the snow had thinned to a light drift of flakes, each one pausing as if considering before it joined the rest. Miss Marple pulled on boots and set out along the lane, a basket on her arm with seed cake for Mrs. Lyle and some folded linen that wanted the vicarage airing cupboard more than it wanted her own. The world was very bright. Children had already made 3 small snowmen on the green and were arguing whether a carrot was necessary in all cases or merely traditional. Mrs. Finch watched from her doorway, as if she had invented snow, and was considering whether to license it. At the vicarage, Mrs. Lyle took the linen with relief. "My airing cupboard has never felt so honored," she said, eyes warm. "You'll stay for a cup?" "I would like that," Miss Marple said, and sat while Mrs. Lyle poured, the tea a comfortable brown. They spoke of the fair and its respectable profits, and of Mrs. Blount's discovery that people bid more for cakes if the person holding the gavel looks as if she might prefer not to sell to them. They spoke, too, of Vera, who had begun writing notes of small, quiet amends, and of Lydia, who had taken to crossing the green with less haste and more thoughtfulness, as if her path had widened. "Do you think," Mrs. Lyle said carefully, "that we should do anything more for Mr. Hollis's mother? She's in a muddle with it all, and though she pretends pride, I think she would fall on help if it fell first on her pantry shelves." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that if you were to send Webb's wife with a basket and no explanation, it would be well received. Pride is often easier to digest when it comes with soup." Mrs. Lyle nodded, grateful. "You see clearly," she said. "I muddle with the heart and only later remember to bring the head up to the same floor." "Most of us are like that," Miss Marple said. "It is why villages require committees." On her way back, Miss Marple stopped at Fox Lane. Vera opened the door before she could knock, as if she had been listening for exactly that step. The room behind her was altered in the small ways Miss Marple had noticed before. Photographs rearranged, a bowl of winter jasmine on the table where once there would have been nothing fragrant at all. Vera looked better, and not because her dress was new. "I had a letter this morning," Miss Marple said, offering the bath note. "I thought you might like to see how well the coat has settled." Vera read and gave back the paper with a breath that might have been the first one taken freely in some days. "I had not expected gratitude from that quarter," she admitted. "I thought a cousin might consider a thing like that his due." "Some people surprise one by being better," Miss Marple said. "It is well to keep room for that as well as for the other sort." Vera hesitated, then said, "I cannot say I am sorry for Hollis. That would not be truthful. But I am sorry for the sort of corner he walked himself into, and for Arthur's manner of pushing him there with such unnecessary relish. I will be kinder. If I cannot be more affectionate, I can at least be less exacting." "That will do very well," Miss Marple said, rising. "Kindness and accuracy are nearly as good together as cream and jam." In the afternoon, the sky cleared in a startlingly decided way, the blue sudden and childlike. Miss Marple went as far as the edge of the moor, because it is sensible to revisit the site of your troubles once they have been tamed, to let your eye resettle the picture. The runnel moved as it always did, indifferent to dramas enacted beside it, and the stile wore its jag of iron the way old things wear their injuries, without comment. She stood a while and remembered how the frost had seemed to ring when the quiet was most intense, and how the smallest smear of color could declare a truth. Then she went home by the long path that skirts the allotments. Tom Yates called to her from his shed, cap pushed back, a pencil behind his ear that was red, as she had previously observed. He came out with sawdust on his sleeve and a look that hovered between embarrassment and a wish to be thought competent. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've been thinking about a gate for Mrs. Finch. Something a person can latch from either side without catching her cuff. I wondered if you'd cast an eye. You see things?" Miss Marple obliged him and made a small suggestion that had to do with the way a hand reaches without thinking. He listened as if she were the foreman of a great works, and then said, almost as an afterthought, "I'm saving for a signboard. T. Yates, joiner. It feels too proud to paint it now, but perhaps in spring." He was red to the ears before he had finished. "In spring," Miss Marple said. "Names sit very well on signboards." The snow squeaked underfoot as the temperature slipped again. At her gate, she met Constable Webb, who looked as if happiness and the possibility of a second child had put breadth in his shoulders and a shine in his eye. He touched his helmet, as he always did, and then, less formally, said, "My wife says to tell you the soup is delivered, and that Mrs. Hollis sent the empty bowl back by her neighbor before she could think what she was doing. That's a good sign," she says. "It is a very good sign," Miss Marple said. "It means appetite will do what sermons cannot." "Inspector says thank you, too," Webb added, coloring faintly. "He says you have a way of letting a man think a thing out loud until he hears himself saying what he needs to hear." "That is kind of him," Miss Marple said. "In my experience, people prefer to be understood by themselves." After tea, she took out the small brown paper parcel she had labeled the other night and untied it. She laid the torn fringe and the smudged card and the fading scrap of paper on the table, one beneath the other, and looked at them as one looks at a list before crossing off the last item. They were not keepsakes, exactly. She kept few of those. They were confirmations that an idea had been correct and a warning against carelessness the next time. She slid them back into their paper, tied the string, and set the parcel near the hearth. The fire took the bundle with the cheerful efficiency of work well matched to flame, and the room smelled briefly of old paper and earned finality. There was a knock just before 7, light and quick. Lydia stood on the step, lamplight behind her, making a small halo of her hair. She had a tin in her hands and the pleased, tentative look of a person, bringing something that is both offering and experiment. "Tom says your pastilles are too stern," she announced, "so I've brought you peppermint creams. If you dislike them, I shall say they were for Mrs. Finch all along." "They will do excellently for me," Miss Marple said, taking the tin. "Mrs. Finch would only feed them to a story." Lydia laughed and then sobered. "I wanted to tell you that I have put my name cards in a different place. Not hidden, exactly, but not where helpful hands might find them. I shall keep people's letters in my own handwriting from now on." "That is a very sound decision," Miss Marple said. "It is wise to notice which parts of one's life are useful to other people's mischief." When Lydia had gone and the little house had grown quiet again, Miss Marple took out her knitting. The pattern was an old one, made of small repeats that looked complicated to a person who had not worked them, and simple to a person who had, which seemed to her a fine arrangement. She found her place and began to count, the numbers falling into their rhythm. Outside, the snow, reconsidering, began again in small flakes that did not commit so much as suggest. She thought of the case as a whole for the last time, the way it had begun with a sound that did not fit the morning and ended with ordinary things restored to their work. She thought of the inspector's face when the line of blue made his thinking tip, of Webb's boyish pride in keeping evidence dry, of Vera's careful notes, of Tom's honest desire for a sign, of Lydia's frightened courage at the stile and the way courage looks afterwards, smaller in the light but steadier for it. She thought of Hollis with a kind of stern fairness. She could understand his pride and still not mistake pride for excuse. The clock on the mantel ticked with the satisfaction of a mechanism that has been wound properly and expects, with reason, to be so again tomorrow. Miss Marple set down her needles, reached for the sensible kettle prize, and poured water over the tea as if blessing were a practical skill one could apply to leaves. The room gathered itself around her, warm and exact. There would be other puzzles, because people are an inexhaustible source of them, and because villages, like families, invent their own dramas when deprived of larger ones. There would be church flowers to arrange, and a fair committee to rein in, and a boy to advise on the height of a gate latch. There would be letters and lists, and the small business of making the world go smoothly for those inclined to bump it. There would be mornings when the Moor glittered, and afternoons when it sulked, and evenings when the runnel talked to itself in the same voice it always used. Miss Marple finished her tea and folded her hands. Outside, the snow took the lamplight and made of it a soft brightness, as if the village wore its serenity the way a good coat wears its warmth, quietly and without remark. She was content to let it be so. The thaw came as it always does in England, not decisively, but with the stubborn, incremental improvements of a housewife setting a room to rights. The snow retreated to hedgerow shadows. The lane showed its brown again. The runnel put on a brighter voice. Miss Marple, who disliked abrupt changes, approved of this sort of quiet altering. On the mantel, the little brass frame with the Queen of Spades caught the thin sun and made a modest gleam like polish on a well-kept shoe. The blue penciled circle on the county letter moved towards its day. People spoke of it with that formal cheerfulness villages use for weddings and funerals alike. Webb's wife planned her washing round it. Mrs. Blount wrote assizes in her notebook between eggs and twine. Mrs. Lyle said a prayer in which justice and mercy were balanced with an exactness that would have done credit to her scone recipe. Vera Pellington put on a hat that did not invite conversation and walked, with Miss Marple and Mrs. Lyle on either side, to the morning train. Much Reading's courthouse was drafty in the way of old buildings that have long ago decided to rely on dignity rather than comfort. The usher's shoes squeaked. The clerk's pen made a dry, persistent sound. Hollis looked smaller across the room than he had looked in his yard. Not because iron reduces a man, Miss Marple thought, but because the absence of his own tools made him less certain of his hands. He pleaded when asked, in a voice that tried for steadiness and only just achieved it. There was little drama. The business went by stages already marked. The judge's remarks were brief and had in them that mixture of weariness and sternness that tells you he has seen the same shape of folly in a dozen guises this year alone. Miss Marple's evidence, when it was called for, was a tidy parcel. First discovery, no touching, a scrap of frayed wool in a dead man's hand, a damp line on a shoe, a stile with a jag that bit, chalk where chalk ought not to be. Inspector Cray's was fuller and ended with the cane, produced with an economy that respected the court's time and the dead man's dignity. There was a small moment when Mrs. Blount's uprightness nearly unseated her. A constable produced, from the cash box's warped lining, the sealed envelope with the 3 grand prize tickets, flattened where it had slid and been wedged. The vicar looked properly sorrowful at the discourtesy shown his vestry. Mrs. Blount sat very straight and murmured to no one that systems, when followed, prevented confusion. Miss Marple thought, not unkindly, that systems often made their own confusions, but did not say so. There was nothing left to say. Sentence was passed. It made the sort of heavy noise in the room that a door makes when it shuts against weather. On the steps, the wind found Vera's veil and worried it as if it had opinions. She kept her chin up. "I should like to walk back," she said. "If I am sad, it is not the kind of sadness that needs hurrying." Inspector Cray fell in beside Miss Marple as the little party made for the station. And thus, as they say, the case concludes, he murmured. "Though I expect the paperwork will argue with me about that for a fortnight." "It always does," Miss Marple said. "Put the Queen of Spades on the top of the pile. She looks as if she can supervise." He smiled at that. "We found your barley sweets, by the by," he added, as if giving her a small present. Wrapped up with Pellington's envelopes in his desk at home. He'd written names on 3 of them for people to whom he meant to return small sums owed, not much, but precise, and then never posted them. Vera said she would see that they went where they should. "That will please Mrs. Blount," Miss Marple said. "She has always liked money to travel with chaperonage." Mrs. Blount appears to like many things with chaperonage. Cray's tone was dry and not unkind. He glanced at Miss Marple. "You were right about the path rather than the stumble. The judge very nearly used your words." He paused. "You don't mind when they take your words and make them heavier?" "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple said, "I have had my words taken and made heavier by godchildren, vicars, and women's committees for 40 years. So long as they land where they ought, I don't much mind who carries them." On the train, the three women sat companionably, each with her thoughts. Mrs. Lyle counted parishioners in her head and apportioned casseroles. Vera looked out at the fields, where the last of the snow still lay in the furrows like a forgotten sheet, and held her mouth still in the particular way of a person refusing to let pain rearrange her face. Miss Marple watched a little boy opposite bite his toffee with the careful ferocity common to small boys, and thought how often grown men bite on pride with the same expression. Back in Heatherford, the afternoon had a pale mildness in it that made people lift their faces to no great effect but some comfort. Mrs. Finch, informed by the grocer's boy even before the train had quite come to a stop, had already told the baker that it was all settled proper, and the baker had agreed and knocked his peel twice against the oven bricks, as if to underline the matter. Lydia had set her work table nearer the window and was taking longer stitches that still landed precisely. Tom Yates, with a red pencil over his ear and a plan in his pocket, had polished the good plane and written T. Yates, joiner, faintly in chalk on a board to get the spacing right. He rubbed it out and wrote it again, and the second time the name sat more comfortably, as names do when they accept themselves. There were small things to be done that no court troubles itself with. Miss Marple, returning the judge's draft to the vicar's wife in a phrase that made sense only to the two of them, stopped in at the post office to buy stamps and left with a parcel of eggs she had not intended to purchase, because Mrs. Crispin said the hens, being contrary females, had chosen that day to lay with exemplary diligence. She carried the eggs home as carefully as if they were opinions. On the green, Eddie Partridge held forth to two boys younger than himself about footprints and the science of detecting them, producing from his pocket a muddy bit of something that might have been evidence in better hands. Miss Marple, in passing, suggested that his future lay more in milk than in detection, and Eddie, so addressed, settled his cap and decided to be proud of milkmen. In Fox Lane, Vera Pellington was writing. The hat with the veil lay on a chair. The green and gold scarf, now without its unpleasant history, thanks to Miss Marple's sense of using good things for good and not for symbolism, had been sent to Mrs. Webb, who had a cold that would not quite be told to stay at home. Vera's letters were not long, but they were exact, and where money could not be sent, she sent an apology with a sentence in it that made the recipient stand a little straighter. It is a rare gift, that sort of sentence, and one that people remember longer than they remember the sums. Towards evening, Miss Marple took a turn to the edge of the moor. The ground had the squeak that says frost may return if the night persuades it. The stile looked innocent, which was only its habit. The runnel, untroubled, made small confidences to the stones and asked nothing back. She stood where Arthur Pellington had fallen and thought not of him as a figure in a case, but as a man who had his particularities like anyone else. Barley sweets, neat envelopes, a manner of talking that was a habit too long indulged. She thought of Cyril Dove's quick, misguided cleverness, and wondered whether any person had ever taught him the skill of losing gracefully. And she thought, with the fairness she always tried to keep intact. Of Hollis's pride, and how pride, when it stops serving a man and requires service of him instead, has the same look in the eye as hunger. At home, the sensible kettle made its obliging little sound. Inspector Cray, who had developed the habit of arriving at odd hours with the air of a man who has only one question and a pocketful of thanks, knocked and was admitted. "I thought," he said, not bothering with preamble, "you might like to know we've had the last of the forensics back. Paint on the cane ferrule, chalk on the card, fibers in the scarf, all tidy as a sermon." "It is always pleasant when sermons tidy what life has strewn about," Miss Marple said. "Sit down. You have the look of a man who has earned a biscuit." He accepted one and ate it in the abstracted way of a person whose mind is only half in his mouth and half on his list. "There's a thing that bothers me, though it's not a thing for the files. Hollis's mother sent word to say thank you for the soup. That's Webb's wife's doing, I know. She asked if she might see her son before he's moved on. I said she might. I don't know whether it was the right kindness." "It was the right one," Miss Marple said. "There are kindnesses one regrets and kindnesses one does not. That is one of the second sort." He nodded. "I thought as much, but I prefer to have you say it." He stood, then hesitated. "There'll be another case sooner than I'd like. There always is." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And there will be seed cake and knitting and parish meetings in between, which is why the other sort can be borne." After he had gone, she wrote 2 short notes. One to Mrs. Lyle about the height of the hymn numbers board. People in the 3rd row could not see the 5s. And one to Tom Yates suggesting that a gate latch that can be lifted with a mittened hand is a greater kindness than any public apology. She addressed them, put the stamps on straight, and felt she had done good work in the world without any racket. Later, as dusk came in with that particular blue that belongs only to late winter, Lydia tapped at the window and lifted the tin of peppermint creams like a lantern. They sat a while with the lamplight turned down a notch for comfort and spoke. Not of trials or evidence, but of whether jasmine can be coaxed to flower again on a windowsill and whether children prefer barley sweets to peppermint. Lydia said children preferred the person who handed the sweets, and Miss Marple said this was a truth more widely applicable than Lydia knew. When the evening was finished and the little house made its pleased settling noises, Miss Marple laid her hand for a moment on the Queen of Spades in her brass frame, and then took it down and slipped it into a drawer. Caution has its place, but trophies do not. In the morning, she would ask the landlord for an ordinary card to fill the frame, perhaps the 2 of hearts, which is a less dramatic creature, but steadier. She smiled at the thought. The clock ticked its approbation. The Moor lay beyond, ready to glitter again or to brood as it fancied. The runnel would speak in the same voice tomorrow that it had used yesterday. People would go on being as they are, vexing, dear, foolish, brave in their small ways, and legible to a careful eye. Miss Marple folded her hands, warmed them round her cup, and felt that rarest of satisfactions, not triumph, which is noisy, but completion, which is quiet and exact, and allows one, at last, to put the light out. A fortnight later, the last of the frost had retreated into the shadows of north-facing walls, and the hedgerows wore catkins like a whisper that spring was considering its entrance. The runnel sounded brisk and businesslike, as if it had remembered there were places to be. Miss Marple approved of the world in this mood. It encouraged people to tidy what winter had left undone. She lifted the little brass frame from the dresser, slipped the Queen of Spades gently into a drawer with her needles and spare tape measure, and slid into its place an ordinary 2 of hearts that the landlord at the King's Bell had produced with a flourish and a wink. "Steadier company," he had said, and she had agreed. There were a number of small matters she had promised herself to set right. The hymn numbers board in the church had been hung half an inch too high for the shorter of Mrs. Lyle's girls. Miss Marple brought a step stool and an air of consultation rather than criticism, and between them they found a better height that spared both girl and dignity. The latch on Mrs. Finch's new garden gate, contrived by Tom Yates, now lifted perfectly from either side, even by mittened hands. Eddie Partridge, deputed to test it, solemnly prodded and lifted until Miss Marple pronounced it a foolproof. "For fools of our village," she added, which pleased Eddie more than accuracy might have. Tom's signboard had progressed from chalk to paint. It leaned to dry on trestles outside his shed, the letters neat without being priggish. T. Yates, joiner. Lydia had brought by a small parcel of sandwiches, the kind that admit to thrift by not pretending to abundance, and sat on the step while Tom explained the difference between a plane that behaves and one that sulks. Miss Marple admired the signboard and the sandwiches impartially. She was content to let such companionship fatten itself on jobs and errands until it knew its own nature. Vera Pellington, who had been stiff with the effort of bearing things correctly, had found her balance in small generosities that were not theatrical. She sent a basket with oranges to Webb's wife in the interests of appetite, and she called on Mrs. Hollis with a jar of soup and a sentence which, while not an apology for anything, was an acknowledgment of suffering without the offense of pity. Miss Marple watched these offerings take their intended effect and felt the village's fibers tighten in the right places. It is no use having a pattern, she thought, if one refuses to mend where it has frayed. Inspector Cray came of an afternoon, tapping the door in the unconsciously peremptory way of men who have worn boots through other people's rooms for a living. He brought with him a dossier he never opened and a small paper bag from the baker's, which he hoped might be exchanged for tea without comment. "We've sent Hollis on to remand," he said when his cup was set before him. His mother saw him. There was less fuss than I expected and more sense. Webb says he felt superfluous and was delighted. "That is the right way for policemen to feel at domestic scenes," Miss Marple said, "and for vicars at christenings." Cray smiled. "I'm learning to look where you tell me. It shortens the distance. A clerk in much reading asked me yesterday whether I had a Mrs. Marple on staff and whether he could borrow her for the ration frauds in his parish. I told him you charge more than the county can afford." He took from his pocket a card that had been bullied flat by official papers. "You're two of hearts." She said it in the frame, and the room seemed to approve, as rooms do when an arrangement pleases them. Cray looked about as if the furniture might nod. "You will not be insulted if I say I hope we do not meet again professionally for a long spell," he said. "I shall be flattered to be asked to judge the jam at the Easter sale," Miss Marple said, and he took the hint and the last biscuit and went. There remained the question of Mrs. Blount's raffle tickets, which had lost none of their authority by having spent a week pressed like a dried leaf behind the cash-box lining. Mrs. Blount had created a new system, of course. She always did after a muddle, this time involving an envelope within a tin within a larger box padlocked to the vicarage umbrella stand. Miss Marple applauded the engineering, and then, with the gentleness that makes correction acceptable in adults, suggested that writing the winners' names in pencil in the notebook as well might allow the triumph of redundancy over misadventure. Mrs. Blount adopted the idea and subsequently forgot it was not her own, which was, Miss Marple thought, a happy outcome for all. On market day, she encountered young Eddie again, holding court by the grocer's with the serious swagger of a calf newly aware of its legs. He produced, from the depths of his pocket, a parcel wrapped in greasy paper, a scrap of rubber heel in which he had cut a notch. For practice, he confided. So I'll know prints when I see them. I recommend you also practice carrying milk without spilling and returning change without error, Miss Marple said. Those are daily arts that feed a family. Heel notches, while interesting, generally do not. Eddie considered this and then brightened. It is a relief to a boy to be told that competence is an adventure within his reach. In Fox Lane, Vera had replaced the winter jasmine with a pot of primulas that looked faintly surprised at their own optimism. She showed Miss Marple a small ledger, the ordinary kind grocers use, where she had copied a list of names and sums and cross-hatched the items already settled. I find, she said cautiously, the precision has its place even in mercy. If I write it down, I cannot tell myself a story about having done more than I have. She closed the book. I do not intend to be saintly. I intend to be exact and less unkind. Exactness is merely kindness in sensible shoes, Miss Marple said, and left her with the primulas receiving more light than was strictly necessary. The Moor had the look it wears when it would like to be thought green, but must admit to brown. Miss Marple walked to the stile, placed her palm on the iron catch in the friendly way one greets an old adversary after. The quarrel has cooled, and then took the longer path home by the allotments where men in caps worried politely at soil that did not yet want to be bothered. The runnel chattered, as it always did, quite independent of human drama. It is good, she thought, to have something near one that refuses to be impressed. There was a small domestic puzzle waiting on her hall table, as there often was when Mrs. Lyle wrote in haste. The hymn-board numbers have gone astray again, the note said. 3 5s, no 7. Can you suggest where to look? Miss Marple smiled, and before taking off her coat, took the sensible kettle from its hook, set it on the hob, and wrote a reply. Look in the bottom of the umbrella stand under the padlocked box. People put small things in large, safe places when startled. Also, Webb's little boy favors 7s for drawing. Offer him a spare and he may return yours. The note went by Eddie's hand, and the problem resolved within the hour with a laughter that did the parish good. That evening, Lydia tapped and came in with peppermint creams to replenish the tin she had allowed Tom to plunder. She sat near the fire and, with the innocence of newly unknotted days, spoke of thread and of a child's skirt she had been asked to lengthen without making it look penitential, and of how names stitched on cuffs seemed to make men stand straighter even in their own kitchens. Tom says he doesn't need his name on anything, she said. And then, with a blush that was more amusement than confusion, but he liked watching me write it. Men are often fond of seeing themselves spelled correctly, Miss Marple said. It reassures them. Lydia laughed, and in a while went contentedly home. The lane outside had a polish from the day's mildness. The night drew a thin veil across the hedges. Miss Marple tidied away the cups, wrote a line to Mrs. Lyle about primulas and patience, and a handful of words to Vera, praising the ledger and asking whether she might spare a cutting of the winter jasmine when it thought of blooming again. She set the 2 of hearts straight in its frame. The card looked back at her with the agreeable frankness of a face that has nothing to hide. She opened the drawer where the Queen of Spades lay, and after a moment's consideration, tucked the older card behind the frame. Not to display, but to keep, as one keeps a thorn pressed in blotting paper, a memento that warns as well as reminds. The kettle, when it boiled, had the exact sound it always had, which was one of the village's virtues. Miss Marple poured her tea and sat, hands around the cup, looking not at the fire, but a little to the side of it, where the air seems to hold the day's impressions before it lets them settle. She thought how the business of Arthur Pellington and Cyril Dove had begun with a wrong sound on a bright morning and ended, not with triumphs, but with ordinary things put back to their uses. Scarves warming throats, cards serving games, chalk marking lengths of timber rather than lines of gilt. She thought of Inspector Cray's face when he understood that a path is not a stumble, of Webb's careful pride, of Vera's ledger, of Tom's signboard and Lydia's steady stitch. She thought, with that fairness she tried to reserve for all sides of a question, of Hollis, and of the way men's prides and panics conspire to make disasters look like destinies until someone declines to be impressed. It is a mercy, she reflected, that villages survive not only through rules and officers and systems, but through the daily obedience of people to the small decencies. Returning what one borrows, writing down what one owes, listening more than one speaks, mending what one has torn, and when one cannot mend, finding someone who can. It is those decencies that keep the pattern intact when the weather takes a mean turn. She finished her tea, counted stitches, and set the work aside with the satisfaction of seeing a row complete itself. The room made the minor contented noises of a place that suits its owner. Outside, the runnel said the same few things it always said, and that too was comfort. Miss Marple drew the curtains against a sky that had chosen a charitable blue for the end of a day, turned down the lamp, and let the quiet rest upon her like a shawl. When she went up at last, she paused, as she always did, at the window that looked to the moor. It lay there honest and imperturbable, ready to be beautiful or treacherous as it pleased, with no idea how instructive it had been. She smiled at it, without irony, and said good night to the indifferent dark. Then she went to bed in the contentment that comes of well-placed things and the conviction that, for now, Heatherford could be left to itself. It was Mrs. Lyle's idea in the end, though she would have called it a little tea to quiet tongues. She asked Miss Marple and Inspector Cray to the vicarage, and by some natural law that governs chairs and curiosity, Vera Pellington, Lydia Gray, and Tom Yates found their way there too, each with a reason that was not curiosity, and each, nevertheless, curious. The room was bright, the fire friendly, the tea respectable. Miss Marple set down her cup, folded her hands, and, because she disliked rumors more than she disliked repetition, spoke as if she were reading the last page of a book aloud for people who had been called away from the earlier chapters. Arthur Pellington rose early, she said. He meant to take the float to the vicarage, and to distribute a few small repayments he had written out and then not posted. He liked the small theater of handing money over. He took his cane. He chose the quicker path by the frosted pool. Mr. Hollis, in difficulties and too proud to ask relief, met him there. There had been talk between them already. Arthur had threatened to shut Mr. Hollis out of credit at the Thursday game, and that sort of shutting out can feel like a hand on a man's throat. They argued. There was a push, perhaps two. Mr. Pellington fell and struck his head on a stone. People are often surprised by how short a distance it takes to die. No one moved. In such silences, even a kettle must listen. Miss Marple went on gently. Mr. Hollis's first thoughts were not generous. He hid the cane in the hedge. He took the box. He meant to hide it to make the morning story more complicated than it needed to be. He wrapped it not elegantly, but conveniently when the chance came. That chance comes here. She inclined her head toward Lydia. Because Mr. Dove, an opportunist by habit, saw Mr. Hollis near his shed with the box and believed he could make himself useful and later paid. He went to Miss Gray, who was soft-hearted, and asked for something to cover a thing that ought to be kept from unkind eyes. The nearest cloth was Mrs. Pellington's scarf, left to be mended. Miss Gray, meaning kindness, wrapped the box and gave it to Mr. Dove, who put it behind the font, where it would be found without being accused. He told himself he had done a good deed. He had also made himself necessary. and men who make themselves necessary very often become dangerous to other people's plans. Vera's hands, steady on her saucer, tightened. Then the box in the church was not my disgrace. No, my dear, Miss Marple said. It was a veil drawn over someone else's. But veils show their weave if one looks. The scarf's fringe told a tale twice, once in the church, where it lay too smoothly, and once at the stile, where it tore because someone used it like rope and not like silk. Inspector Cray touched the edge of the table with a forefinger, a policeman's way of nodding. "And then Dove," he prompted, not because he did not know, but because he preferred Miss Marple's order to his own. Mr. Dove had seen too much, Miss Marple said. He had watched Mr. Hollis with the box. He had arranged for Miss Gray to give him the means to move it in a way that would speak of Mrs. Pellington and not of anyone else. That made him valuable to himself and intolerable to Mr. Hollis. The note that brought him to the card room was written in Mrs. Pellington's hand by a person who had borrowed a sample from Miss Gray's little box of names. It is a rare village where a tradesman has not done a helpful errand and seen where the useful things are kept. Lydia flushed and made a small sound of apology that Miss Marple forestalled with a look. "In the card room," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Hollis struck from behind. Men who boast they fight fair rarely do so when no one is watching. He added a queen of spades from a deck he'd marked with blue chalk at his bench and thought himself clever for introducing a motif." A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Motifs are helpful to readers, Inspector, but not to criminals. Chalk does what chalk always does. It clings. There was chalk on the card, on the stile, and later on Mr. Pellington's cane, where the ferrule took paint from the same iron that had caught threads before." Tom Yates cleared his throat, the noise men make when they have been thinking too hard for comfort. "And the brass button by the runnel, ma'am. They near hung it on me." "Yes," Miss Marple said lightly, "because people enjoy a hook to hang their certainty on. But your jacket uses horn, Mr. Yates. I saw the set and Lydia's neat stitching where one had been replaced. The brass was older, from the kind of best coat that tradesmen keep for Sundays and card nights. Mr. Hollis's had such buttons, and one had sheared at the shank. He did not notice. Men notice losses in their pockets more than losses at their cuffs." Miss Marple took up her spoon, then set it down again, as if that small movement were a punctuation mark. The scrap in Mr. Pellington's hand was the first true thing he told us, though he did not mean to. It was a thread of good dark worsted, finer than most men in the village wear. Mr. Hollis's Sunday coat is such worsted. The weave matched. I thought for a morning that the velvet mark in the cash box pointed to Mrs. Pellington's black coat. But later I remembered Arthur's own black coat and how often, earlier in the week, we had all seen him run errands in it. Dust remembers poorly. Threads remember precisely. When I saw Mr. Hollis at cards, do you recall? There was a lifted stitch at his underarm seam where rough iron would have caught a man who lifted his arm to shove. It is an old woman's habit to look at seams. We have mended too many not to see when they mean something. Cray's smile was brief and unhidden. "And when he tried the style for Miss Gray," he said, "he bought himself the end of it." "Desperation is clumsy," Miss Marple agreed. It tore what had been mended. It dropped a blue pencil where a man with tidy habits would have put it back in its tin. It stamped a heel with a nick that matched his working boots. There is a point where all one can do is stand back and let people show you who they are. She looked round the little group, not as a lecturer would, but the way a good hostess checks whether plates are within reach. "So you see, my dears, there is no trick in any of it. only the ordinary faithfulness of small things to their nature. Chalk clings, iron snags, velvet leaves a nap. Scarf fringe tells you how it was handled. Men brag about the same cards they play badly. And those who have been made to feel small push harder than is safe. The rest is patience. Vera set down her cup carefully. "I have been unkind, Miss Marple," she said, in the plain tone of a person adding a figure correctly. "I thought the worst of myself and the worst of others. I have been exact these last weeks to repair what I could. I shall try to be exact in refusing to make dramas when an apology will do. That will save us a great deal of crocheting on the parish committee," Mrs. Lyle said, with a smile that trembled and then held. Tom, who had the useful gift of being able to combine gratitude with shyness without making either tiresome, said, "I never thanked you proper, ma'am, for not letting them stick that button on me." "You are welcome," Miss Marple said, "but it was you who kept your buttons." Lydia's laugh was a small bell. Even Vera's mouth softened. Inspector Cray rose at last, straightening as men do when they put the weight of the room back on its furniture. "You've given us a good ending, Mrs. Marple," he said. "It will be better for having been explained sensibly." "There are few endings," Miss Marple said, "that are not improved by a little sense." She glanced at the window, where the light had the clean, undecorated look of late afternoon. And by tea. When they had gone and the vicarage had resumed its customary noises, cups set down, a poker set to rights, Mrs. Lyle humming not quite in tune, Miss Marple walked home by the green. The signboard outside Tom's shed had taken its full coat of paint, and the name sat as if it had always been there. In Fox Lane, the primulas had taken heart and lifted their faces a degree. In the lane, Eddie Partridge was carrying 2 bottles of milk with exaggerated care, and, when Miss Marple looked at his hands, he lifted his chin as if saluting a superior officer. The runnel talked as it always did, uninterested and therefore reliable. She let the sound accompany her to her own gate. Inside, the little brass frame caught the thin sun. The 2 of hearts looked back in its steady way. Miss Marple straightened it a hair's breadth and, because she was a tidy soul and liked lives and stories to end where they were fit to end, she thought with quiet satisfaction that all the true things had been said and the false ones shown their proper size. Then she put on the kettle, not because a case was finished, but because a day was, and sat by the fire with her work, letting the pattern resume itself exactly where it had been left.